Hey, hello, Mark.
Hi, Roger. How you doing?
How are you doing?
Thank
Thanks
you.
very much for doing this. Do you want to tell the world where you're transmitting from?
Right, currently I'm beside a rainforest west of Auckland in New Zealand,
All right.
and it's summertime here.
So,
So,
what does it mean to be by a rainforest?
so we're at the very edge of the suburb. So the road I'm on is the very last road before you. I'm looking out the window now at just a huge expanse of rainforest between here and the coast. It's really amazing.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Mm,
And
yeah,
there's all these kind of stereotypical things about what a rainforest is. So, what
yeah.
what what is it? What is it like?
It's actually how Ireland was before farmers got
Yeah.
there. Ireland was a rainforest island as well. It's basically a forest with tons of rain. That's all it is really. And this place has got tons of both. Ireland is one of the rare exceptions in the EU that's only got 1% of its forestry left. The average is about 11%. So Ireland used to be a rainforest too. It's got plenty of rain, but less forest now.
Yeah, it's funny actually because I don't suppose many people will kind of realize that. And also, Sentient Rights Island did do a session last night
Yeah, that's right.
with someone who was making that very point about that, because obviously the English, they tried to make Ireland essentially into a cattle farm, cattle
That's right.
in, didn't they? And so they
Mhm.
shipped the humans out and brought the cows in, that kind of stuff.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
So. Hi, Kate. Well, yeah, you can watch it on catch up, and it's going to be over 2 weeks as well. So it's quite interesting because next week will be the second day of November, so it's the second day of World Vegan Month. So I've got a special going to be running on World Vegan Day itself, the first, and we have a special guest, Wendy. We had to cancel that the other day, but it's also going to. I'm thinking of doing something like a 12-hour live stream, including the Wendy one. I've actually written to the BBC. Well, I wrote to Simon Amstell's management to try and get the rights to show Carnage because it's not being shown very much. But they don't have them, so they suggested I contact the BBC, which I have. They haven't replied, so whether that'll all work out, I don't know. But it'd be quite good to show Carnage because I think apart from its original airing on the BBC, I don't think many people have seen it on the grounds that it's one of those that the BBC always removed from wherever it might be put up, Vimeo or YouTube, that kind of stuff, one of those kind of things. Right. Okay. Well, I want to ask you a couple of questions before we start then, Mark. First of all, your project has got a really impressive scope. We talk about 200 years, right? So kind of what prompted that? And the second part of it is the focus on Ireland. Why both those? The size and the focus on Ireland.
Okay. I think if we start with the PowerPoint now, and if I lead you through the photographs that I have accumulated as I was doing this research, and it will help explain the origins of the idea for the book and illustrate some examples from the book as well.
Yeah,
So
good idea.
yeah. So if we go in through here, so a couple of years back, I was invited on to a podcast called Policed, which is a podcast that's still running, where Irish citizens get interviewed about their experience with the Garda Síochána, the Irish police, across various issues. So there was abortion rights, there was travellers' rights, and I was invited on to speak about animal rights because I was involved in the embryonic hunt saboteurs movement in Southern Ireland, in the Republic of Ireland, around the mid-90s. Hunt sabotage had been quite common in the north of Ireland for quite some time, but had only recently spread south. And I had helped set up a group in Galway because I had some experience sabbing over in Edinburgh with the Scottish sabs a few years previous. So we went out on a bunch of sabs against the Galway Blazers. We were duly ambushed and had the merry hell kicked out of us in front of the police. And that prompted the invite onto the police podcast, where I was talking about my interactions and experience with the police after the attack and trying to get charges pressed and so on. So as I was doing some research before the interview, I was looking online to see what had happened to the Hunt sabotage movement following that attack, because I had emigrated to the UK about 3 or 4 months after that attack, and I'd lost contact with the movement in Ireland. Really, I was very involved in the UK movement, but I'd lost contact with anyone involved in the Irish movement. So I went online to see what I could find. And I stumbled across an archive. So this is some of the stuff I came across in the archive. There's an online archive called the Irish Newspaper Archive, and it's an online resource of every newspaper ever printed in Ireland since I think the very first one was the Belfast Telegraph in 1738 or something. Every newspaper ever printed in Ireland ever since, up till yesterday, is out there, and they've got a really good search engine. So if you put in a few primary words like animal liberation or animal liberation front or hunt sabotage, tons of stuff came up. I was stunned by this. I'd been involved in hunt sabotage and legal campaigning in Ireland for many years, and I hadn't heard about almost any of these actions at all. So bearing in mind that at the time, before the internet, information was really parochial. So if an action happened and got reported in, for instance, the Connacht Tribune or something, unless you lived in that area and had access to that newspaper, then you didn't get a chance to read it. So information was very fragmented, very temporary. So it was really hard to have an idea of what was going on really then. So when I went online and I came across all these hundreds, maybe thousands of articles, opinion pieces, letters to the editor, exposés, reportage of loads and loads of many small scale actions being done on behalf of animals in Ireland on both sides of the border. From the 1980s, I'd say it peaked around the mid 90s, and from around 2010 onwards, it's really been in a very sharp decline. So it was really fascinating for me to come across this history. And the more I went online and looked into it, the more characters I was coming across. So, for instance, the very first mention of a vegan anywhere in Ireland was actually around the 17th century. There was a guy called Robert Linnan Cook, who was probably the only vegan in Ireland at the time. He was originally a wool trader from Wexford, and then converted to veganism, even though the word wasn't around then. He was essentially a straight edge vegan, what we would now call a straight edge vegan. So he didn't drink, didn't take any drugs. I think there was only drink then, and was a strict vegan. So he was very much like the modern age straight edge movement, which was an offshoot of the anarcho-punk movement around the 1980s, where they didn't drink and they didn't do drugs, and they're all hardcore vegan, and it was called straight edge. So Robert Linnan Cook was probably the first mention of a straight edge character before that term was invented, centuries before that term was invented, and he was famous in the area for a while, and there was things written about him. He was a very unique character. Story goes that once his farm hands caught a fox that was wandering around his farm, and instead of killing the fox, which is the usual response from a farmer then and now, I would say, Robert Cook came out and lectured him on the commandment of "Thou shalt not kill," and then they formed a line. The workers and farmers, they formed a line for like a gauntlet for the fox to run through as they struck the fox, and then allowed the fox to escape. So they punished the fox for being on the farm, but they wouldn't kill the fox, and then they allowed him to escape. They made him run the gauntlet and then escape. So I don't know if we'd be advocating that.
It's a novel approach, isn't it?
It is a novel approach, and it was a very unique then and now. So it just goes to show that even going way back, there was this sort of line of thinking. But it wasn't until wasn't really until the guy on the bottom here, which is Richard Hair Trigger Martin, which is where the name of the book came from. The guy on top, Thomas Wentworth, was the Lord Deputy of Ireland, which was a position given to Englishmen who were the representative of the Crown in Ireland. And this guy had complete control, as if he was the King of Ireland at the time. So he had come over from England, where practices like tying your plow to the tail of the cow rather than to a strap around the cow was banned and hadn't been used for a very long time. Whereas in Ireland, it was endemic, and the reason for that is because the Irish, they were so piss poor they couldn't afford anything, so they had to tie these plows to the tails of these beasts, which caused immense pain to the bulls and cows, obviously. But it was done out of necessity, it seemed, rather than anything else. So anyway, it was banned by Thomas Wentworth, and it is regarded as the first piece of state legislation forbidding particular acts of violence against particular animals, and that was in 1635. So the Wentworth Act precedes the Martin Act by about 2 centuries, and is therefore the very first state law around animal welfare. But it was Trigger Martin, the guy on the bottom here, that really set the ball rolling. This was a guy who was really passionate about animal welfare, not animal rights. He was a fox hunter himself. Okay, so he was very much a man of his time, but he was very much ahead of the curve at the same time. So he would spend his weekends chasing and shooting foxes in his vast country estates in Galway, and he would during the week he would be prosecuting for beating up donkeys in the courts as soon as he got his bill pushed through. So Richard Martin was an MP and a landlord in West Galway, a man of huge wealth and power, so much power that he had the right to draft and enact his own laws in his fiefdom. Essentially, it was an archaic law.
He had a kind of prison, didn't he? I think you've got a slide coming up with it.
That's right. He set up the world's first prison here, which is in a tiny islet in, what's the name of the Ballynahinch, I think, loch in West Ireland, in West Galway, which was part of his estate. And this old tower here is an old tower from the Vikings. The Vikings built it as a watchtower nowadays, and then it was just a ruin. I think it's actually gone now, but back in the day, it was used as a prison for animal abusers. And anyone caught beating a donkey, it seems, he was particularly harsh on people who beat donkeys, and he would roll these people out himself. He would judge them, convict them, sentence them, and then himself, and then roll them out to the little tower here, lecturing them all the way on the evil of their deeds and telling them how long they could expect to spend there. And they would be out there for weeks or months. They would have food and water, but nothing else. So it was the world's first known prison for animal abusers ever, and it's in the west of Galway, and it was run by Richard Martin, who
probably the world's only. I mean, you said only there, question mark, because I don't suppose there's many of those.
I would say there is no more, but I didn't have time to really go into detail on that. So I
wanted to ask you about, Mark, about Humanity Dick, because apart from your account of him, which you can see parts of it coming up, it seems that the official version has been quite sanitized. I mean, for a start off, I've never heard Hair Trigger before to describe him. And he did seem to be a bit of a lad, didn't he? Really. So
he was. Yeah, he was very much a flaneur, which he was a roving dandy with loads of money in his back pocket. He was really fond of dueling, so that's where the Hair Trigger name came from. He had a very short temper, and he was involved in over 100 duels in his time. One of which involved dueling against a guy who had shot a dog of a mutual friend of theirs, who had shot dead a dog of theirs, of a friend of theirs, and he challenged him to a duel. They both ended up shooting each other in the face. In fact, I think I've got an illustration of that somewhere.
Yeah, you do. Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
So before the Martin Act became law, and when harming animals was still considered sort of okay, or it was only damaging property rather than a sentient being. So there was a situation where this guy here, a guy called Fighting Fitzgerald, another gentleman thug from the area, shot dead this dog here that was belonged to Lord Altamont, and was then challenged to a duel by Richard Martin, and they both shot each other in the face. But because ballistics and all that were quite weak and different back then, they actually just had to be escorted off the.
I love the dramatic.
yeah, right.
Actually, hi, Deb. Welcome along. How did he make his money? You're being asked.
He made his money from exploiting his tenants. He was in the top 1% of the top 1%. He was incredibly well off, a very rich man, very privileged, but he did use some of his privilege to a good ends, which is a lot more than I can say for the likes of Fighting Fitzgerald or any other of his kind in his class at that time.
Like an early philanthropist, really, wasn't he?
Basically, yeah. So he had his flaws, and he was part of a system that was deeply cruel and dysfunctional and violent itself. But he took a stand for animals, and he was genuine about it. And he pushed through a bill that protected all farm animals from unnecessary cruelty, whatever that is. And he pushed it through a very reluctant, hostile, and probably bemused Parliament at the time. I would say half of them voting on it at the time were either drunk or asleep, I would say, because it
nothing much has changed then. But didn't you say in your previous except bulls? So what was that?
Yeah, except bulls. So it prohibited unnecessary cruelty against all farm animals except bulls. I don't know why he had this. Why bulls were left out if they were considered to be exempt from such treatment, because such a treatment was endemic in the way they were used anyway. I'm not too sure. It doesn't explain why. He was very, very soft on donkeys and didn't care much about bulls. Again,
unless those were the ones that were attached to the plows quite a lot because of their strength.
Yes, yeah, exactly. So I guess if they were included in the act, it might have shut down farming completely. The way factory farm chickens are excluded from animal welfare laws, I would imagine these days, you know. So he pushed through this bill. It became an act, and then he set up his own police force. This was before any police force existed at all. It was about 5 years before the formation of the Metropolitan Police. He co-founded the RSPCA. So the RSPCA are the world's first police force of any kind, and they were set up specifically to enforce the Martin Bill, the 1820 9 bill or whatever it is, to strictly enforce that, to prosecute people who were inflicting unnecessary suffering on animals. So they would hang around Smithfield's meat market and spot for any breaking of that law, and then try and prosecute these people. It took 16 years since the law came into force. It took 16 years before the first successful prosecution took place, and it was so famous, it was so unique. There was this famous painting done of it, and here's the guy being prosecuted. His name is Bill Burr. He was caught beating up a donkey, which obviously to Richard Martin was the worst thing you could do. So he prosecuted him, and he was forced to bring in the donkey to show the wounds on the donkey's body to the magistrates and to the judge to bring home exactly the severity of the crime. And it was successful, and Bill Burr was fined. And then in a bit of a twist, and you would think he wouldn't want to do this, but Martin offered to pay his fine for him, and his stated intent was that he wanted to set a precedent rather than to punish an individual. So make of that what you will. I would have thought that after 16 years of trying, he'd have been really keen to put the boot in. But anyway, it's the same. He was a man full of compassion, even for the wrong people, I'd say at times. But
then Bill Bailey went into comedy after that, so that's
he did. Yeah, so
Dennis is saying there's a one-man play on Humanity Dick by a teacher from Galway City.
Okay, the slide. If I just go back here quickly, this guy here was doing a one-man play on Humanity Dick back in Galway about 10 years ago as well, and I forget his name, but that's where I got the photograph from. And this is him doing his dueling pose for that. So yeah, so Humanity Dick is still a famous character, and rightly so. He was really ahead of his time. So if we go on then to, so that was the very, very start, the very beginning of a civil and a state response towards the problem of violence against animals or dysfunctional. It was the first attempt to address.
Mark, before you go on, there's one thing I noticed in the book, and I couldn't resist writing it down. It said the RSPCA, where rescuing dogs and cats while eating chickens and pigs makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
And I really wish that a lot of modern day animal advocates would understand that, just as with Humanity Dick, the kind of fox hunting donkey lover kind of thing. It's not a contradiction in terms of that cultural. I mean, this is just part and parcel of cultural speciesism. I just wish that people would understand a bit more, because at the moment the modern movement seems to have got its knickers in a bit of a twist about the RSPCA. It doesn't quite understand it as a traditional welfare group. But there you go.
Yeah, anyway. I think just a quick point on that. Since its very formation, it's had these fault lines baked into it, these incongruities and these inconsistencies. And I think that all came to a head during the 1970s, perhaps in the UK, when there was an attempt by factory farmers and fox hunters to infiltrate the RSPCA. And
successful too. There's a lot of them in there.
And they were able to join, as were ALF types, and vie for control over the board of the RSPCA, because there's so many millions in their bank account that both sides wanted access to it. But both sides had no problem joining and being part of that organization. Fox hunters and ALF militants could both join the RSPCA. It was that of a broad church, and it was that inconsistent in its philosophy. It could accept both extremes. So the RSPCA has always been a hypocritical organization, and probably always will be, because it's operating within the welfare mode rather than rights mode. So unfortunately, that's the case.
Yes, indeed. Okay, so this is where you go through all those ridiculous alternatives to the word vegan, right?
There were so many of them. So when the Vegan Society started in 1944, and Donald Watson and co. were coming up with a new name for themselves. I mean, interestingly, the word vegetarian, I think, initially did mean vegan, and then it became pure vegetarian. And then as the sort of philosophy evolved over thousands of years in India with Buddhism and Jainism and Taoism and all this sort of stuff, vegetarian became to mean someone who consumes dairy and eggs, but not meat. So initially, vegetarian did mean vegan, but because the Vegetarian Society didn't want to have a vegan offshoot, and they insisted that they set up their own society, which is the best decision the Vegetarian Society ever made, I think, was forcing the vegan movement to stand on its own 2 feet and separating itself from the vegan movement, because it is a very different movement, really. So original or initial suggestions for the term vegan or non-dairy consuming vegetarian was what we see here: a dairy banner, Benevorian, Pythagorist after what's his name, Grahamite, which was the Sylvester Graham. Pythagoras was his name. Sylvester Graham was a famous vegan that led a lot of the movements in the 19th century in the US. So Grahamite was considered. Beaumanjurian, I don't know what that means. I presume it's French. I don't really know where they came up with that one. Neo-vegetarian and so on. So I think we dodged a bullet and they picked vegan, which is a great term, to be honest.
So some of those sound like a medical condition to me, Mark.
Yeah, Benevorian, a dairy banner. It's probably the worst, But so here we are. We're all vegans, and
I've got terrible Sanivore today.
A Sanivorian burger. So so we can thank our lucky stars. So the evolution of the restaurant culinary scene in Ireland is really interesting, and I kept coming across these gems of history that I'd never known anything about, and I was completely stunned by the fact that I didn't know anything about them, and no one I knew involved in animal rights or politics knew anything about this either. So let me explain the close connections between the initial vegetarian restaurant movement, and we see some adverts for it here in the 1890s and so on, and they're set up by the Vegetarian Society. They didn't last long, but these were the first expressions of vegetarian culinary scene in Ireland, and then we move on to McDonald's. So one of the first ever vegetarian restaurants was part of a chain set up by a Northern Irish man, and it's now a McDonald's. It isn't that specific McDonald's. That's a McDonald's in, I think it's in Whitehall, after one of the May Day demonstrations passed by it. But yeah, I just put that up there for. So the very first woman that we know of, this is Jenny Wise Power, and she set up the very first, or the second, vegetarian restaurant, which was called the Home Farm Produce Cafe, and it was on Henry Street in Dublin. And there's a little plaque to it still here. The restaurant itself is now I think it's a health food store, but it's where the restaurant was a gathering point and an arms dump for the Republican movement at the time. So this is just prior to the 1916 Rising, and 6 of the 7 people who signed the Declaration of Independence signed it in that restaurant, in that vegetarian restaurant, over presumably plates of vegetarian food, where they would meet Indian revolutionaries and nationalists who were over studying in Dublin, because Dublin, obviously, in Ireland was part of the empire at the time, as was India. So you had a lot of middle-class Indians who were vegetarian by religion. They were coming over to study at the bar in Dublin and to be medical students. And because they were vegetarian, and there was only 1 or 2 vegetarian restaurants in Ireland at the time, both in Dublin, they used to go to the Home Farm Produce Cafe and meet with IRA and IRB activists who were plotting the same sort of thing in Ireland as they were thinking of in India. So the radicals of both countries were meeting in this one place, this Home Farm Produce Cafe on Henry Street. It was full of guns and bombs being stored in the basements. It was revolutionaries and poets and philosophers and so on upstairs sharing vegetarian food and discussing
guns, bombs, and veg. So is that plaque still there then, Mark?
Yes, it's still there. Yeah, it's still there. Yeah, so you can see
there Henry Street,
and it just mentions on a Henry Street, and it doesn't mention that the restaurant was a vegetarian restaurant. It just mentions that at this site was where all these people signed the Declaration of Independence, which is one of the most important landmarks in Irish history, really, and it all happened at the vegetarian restaurant. Now, so the Home Farm Produce Cafe closed in the mid 1920s when Jenny Wise Power left to become a senator in the Irish Senate, and World War II happened, obviously, and this put a freeze really on the vegetarian movement worldwide, I would say, including Ireland. So the story picks up again post World War II in the mid 1940s, and again I came across this evidence of a woman called Moira Henry, who was from Dublin, and she was probably one of the original punks before punk came along. She used to make her own clothes, her own makeup. She was a vegan, and she was the Irish representative for the International Vegetarian Union's annual conferences. The International Vegetarian Union was usually a vegan movement, but it referred to itself as a vegetarian union. So here she is under the blue arrow, Moira Henry. There isn't much known about her life other than she was a known character around Dublin. She was known for her own makeup and clothes and her own style and being vegan. And at that time, I would say she was one of maybe a dozen vegans in Ireland. It was a very, very small movement. Very little is known about her. But she must have found life very isolating and hard, I would say, in Ireland at the time. There was very little understanding or appreciation for the philosophy of animal rights. Catholic Ireland and Catholicism has a notion called dominion, which apparently grants the human race a superiority over everything else. And that has poisoned relationships with animals ever since, really, particularly in the Catholic world. So she was fighting against, she would have been considered to be a contrarian and antisocial. It wasn't just odd, it was deemed to be a hostile rejection of social values, I think, as much as anything else. It put other people on the spot, and I'd say she had a hard time.
A rebel with a cause.
Absolutely, and more strength to her. So I was coming across these people, and I really wanted to celebrate their lives. otherwise they're sort of lost to history. The information is there, but it's so fragmented and piecemeal that unless it's compiled together, like I've done in this book, it's easy to ignore. So,
can you just as a matter of interest, you see that appreciation in the middle? Can you remember where that's from?
The one. Oh, yes, it's. I don't know. It's RG. I don't know who RG is. I presume it's someone else who was involved in the animal rights movement at the time. But that's all that's there. It's from a newspaper. It's an obituary. No, I don't know exactly who RG is. Sorry. Yeah.
Do you remember the publication, Irish Times or something? I suppose.
I think it's the Irish Times. It is the Irish Times from 1997 here. This the obituary at the very end. So if it isn't, I'll let you know. But yeah, if you have a look.
A super vegetarian.
Super vegetarian was another word for vegan, which I quite like. Here's another character, Iron Man Jack McClellan, the Belfast Bulldog. This guy pioneered, as far as I can tell, he was one of the pioneers, if not the pioneer, of a multidisciplinary sports sort of guy. He was a polymath. This guy. He was the champion boxer, footballer, tennis player, runner, and most notably a swimmer. He was this all-encompassing sort of ultra athlete where he would do these mega swims like across Galway Bay or from Tory Island to the mainland, in the North Atlantic in winter and stuff like this. He was real powerhouse. He was a vegan. He's from Belfast. Set up his own chain of health food shops. Very involved in the vegan movement at the time, and uses. Bear in mind that the science around healthy eating and plant-based eating and everything else was very, very primitive and often very wrong at the time. So he was experimenting and proving to the world by using his own body and pushing his body to its absolute limits on a plant-based diet. He was proving how resilient and how healthy a plant-based diet can be. And this is back in the 1950s. So very, very early on, this is when these ideas were barely heard of, and he was proving the power and the endurance of having a plant-based diet. And this guy won award after award. His swim across Galway Bay attracted more people than John F. Kennedy's appearance in Galway the week before. There's hundreds of thousands of people who come out and cheer him on. These days, hardly anyone knows about him. The very scant bits of information I found about him were scattered across these obscure sports websites where they would mention his winnings and all the medals he won and all the championships he won, but never mention the fact that he was vegan. So it was weird. I don't know if they didn't know this themselves, or if it was information that they didn't want to carry on sort of publicizing or what. But there should be statues to this guy everywhere. He was one of the original sorts of strong men of the sort of Iron Man of the whole vegan movement, and he was really proving the opposite of what a lot of people would have assumed that a plant-based diet was all about. So Jack McClellan, he died in 1996. Again, a lot more should be known about this guy, and it's hardly there at all. So again, the book was a good opportunity to bring together these disparate bits of history. So if we move on, okay, so. Again, sort of carrying on the story of the vegetarian vegan culinary movement in Ireland during the 1980s, and really all along, it's been associated with radical politics. So here up the top, you have the Dublin Resource Centre, and that had the Well-Fed, I think it was, cafe there. The Hare Krishna movement has always been associated with vegetarianism. They aren't actually vegetarians; they're prasadivores, which means that their food has to be approved by Hare Krishna. And Hare Krishna doesn't approve of eating meat, but loves the consumption of dairy. In fact, I think it's the food of the gods. So I think they have 3 restaurants in Dublin now.
They're down to 1 now, Mark.
Down to 1, okay.
Well, I was going to ask you a question about it, funny enough, because when I first came to Dublin, there was those 3 dotted around the city. And then there was the rise of the vegan restaurants, and then seemed to be that they started to peter out. So maybe it was the fact that Govinda's and Cornucopia was about the only place you could go at one point.
Yes,
but then that changed, so that might have been it.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, they specialize, and they probably still do, in sort of vegan slop, really, or vegetarian. It was curry and rice and stuff like this. And they used to always be turning up at festivals. I remember seeing them every year. They'd have a tent at Glastonbury, and it was free food as long as you listened to their chanting and stuff like that. So they sort of mean well, but they have this weird idea about milk being the fruit of the gods, and they're all right to have cows, and they allow the calves a certain amount of time to get some of the milk from their mom, and then they take the rest. They have this weird way of going about getting their milk. If I was them, I'd just go to plant milk, and I would get rid of the.
Yeah, well, this site is the middle, what do we call it? Can't remember the road now, but I can take you to it. I can't remember the road. Right. Abbey Street, that's it, Middle Abbey Street, and they're at the moment they're trying to open a kind of a Himsa farm for that very reason, that they want to get this so-called Himsa milk. You know, it's quite interesting what you said there about they claim that God designed cow milk for humans and not just the calf.
Yeah. It's weird, isn't it? Right. So it's weird the way people do these mental convolutions to get over the trauma of the practices that they're engaged in, and they come out with these weird ideas that So this is what they're into. They're all right if you like vegetarian curry slop and all that. But they've been on the peripheries of the scene really since forever. Even in the hardcore punk movement, there was a strain of Hare Krishna hardcore, and bands that were playing really fast punk, and they're all vegan and into Hare Krishna. That's
quite interesting. One thing that you might not know, Mark, which is the fact that Govinda's used to be, a vegetarian and vegan kind of restaurant, but the main signage was vegetarian.
Yeah.
And sometimes it still is. But now, in terms of their window displays, they've now got vegan and vegetarian.
Yeah.
So there's been a switch. So that's pretty good.
Oh, it's clear that the vegan movement has overtaken the vegetarian movement for the first time in its existence in the last, I'd say, since 2015. There's been a revolution in this, and veganism now is really where it is at, and vegetarian is yesterday's news, really. Do you remember back in the day when being a vegetarian was the most radical thing you could be? People were like, "Oh my God, this is," and they would consider it to be this radical Marxist or something like that. And nowadays, so the Overton window has shifted dramatically, I'm glad to say. So I hope that people, and that the vegetarian scene is being bypassed by the vegan movement, and I think that's been reflected in examples.
Well, another thing you may not know is that the Irish Vegetarian Society have just voted to become the Irish Vegan Society.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay, that is interesting. There was a similar debate that was going on here for a while. Actually, the New Zealand Vegetarian Society was making sounds about becoming a vegan movement, but they flipped back, and they've dug their heels in, and they're now a vegetarian movement only. But it is interesting to see that it used to always be the vegan movement was the little cousin of the vegetarian movement, which was always much bigger, numerically and financially and all that. Now that's changing as people's priorities shift in the right direction. So if we move on to the next slide here, we have the famous Gyro's Vegetarian Vegan Cafe, which was connected to the anarcho-punk Warzone collective up in Belfast during the 1980s and 1990s. It was a premises in the city centre of Belfast that was given to these bunch of punks that turned it into a gig venue and a recording place and a screen printing workshop and a vegetarian vegan cafe. And it was going for years. It was the only place in the centre of Belfast at that time that had anything going for it. The rest of the centre of Belfast was surrounded by sandbags and soldiers and helicopters and CCTV, and there was no social scene there at all because of the the communities just sort of kept apart, and the city centre was like a war zone and all that. So you had War Zone Cafe and Collective in the middle of the city, and it was probably the only place at the time where young Protestants and Catholics could get together in a violence trouble-free place and have a really good time, and no one cared about your religion or your background. I think it was the only place at the time that provided that, and it was famous around the world. I've never been there myself, unfortunately. It stopped and started a few times. It isn't going at the moment, but it had a run of about 18 years in total, and was a vital part of the Northern Ireland punk scene.
It looks like a pretty small stage there, Mark.
I'd say there was barely any stage there at all, but there was some brilliant bands there. Fugazi and all sorts played there. So it was a world famous venue despite its size. The atmosphere there, I'd say, was something else. Given the context. So as I say, the vegetarian culinary scene has always been intertwined with the radical politics scene of Ireland and elsewhere, basically for over a century. So it's interesting to see that vegetarianism and veganism has always been seen as part of a wider struggle, as part of a wider liberation project. It isn't a be all end all in itself. So we can see that going right back to the days of Jenny Wise Power, right up to Gyros and beyond, including the Key Co-op in Cork, which was the huge, big, rambling building in the middle of Cork City. It's still there. It's a restaurant, cafe. It used to be a bookshop. I don't think they're doing that anymore. But it was where I was exposed. Me and my friends were exposed to all the Peter Singer's Animal Liberation was there. You could buy magazines from the Class War organization, all sorts of things. It was the only place in Cork and probably in Munster that where you could buy soy milk and radical literature and books and so on. And there was it's still going on, and it really was a beacon of hope in Cork at the time. It was intimately involved in the access to abortion, the anti-ban on divorce, all sorts of the socially progressive movements that were around in Cork at the time. It was the Key Co-op that provided a physical meeting space for all of that to happen, and it's still going on. Interestingly, the initial causes that the Key Co-op was fighting have largely been won, and now they've moved on to other causes. So as I say, the Overton window in Ireland generally has shifted enormously, and now you can get divorced, you can get abortion. There's the LGBTQI and all the rest of it. It's really progressed an awful lot in terms of animal rights and socially generally. And the Key Co-op has been at the heart of all that in Cork. So it was initially deemed to be it was often getting raided by the police, and because of the pro-Republican sort of stuff that you would get in there. It would get attacked by local skinheads at times. So it did attract trouble. These days it's fine. It's been on the scene for 30 or 40 years, so it's fine now. But at the time, it was often it was treated with hostility by the public at large often. But yeah, it was really the center of radical politics in Cork then and now. On to the next slide then. We have the very first vegan place ever in Ireland was a pop-up restaurant called Seduced, run by this woman here who was Brazilian, I think. I can't remember her name. But yeah, it was a periodic raw food, vegan, organic pop-up restaurant. So a very, very limited, very, very niche market there. It didn't last for more than a year, but it was the very first, and this is in 2013. This was.
It was very expensive as well, wasn't it? I don't know if
Pardon?
It was very expensive. I remember that.
Okay, yeah, it probably was. I would say, yeah. So yeah, it was the first attempt, and it didn't last. I think it was too narrow in its appeal, perhaps, and a bit early.
It was the kind of I always call it kind of for food snob type things, you know.
Okay.
Little bitty plates with a bit of drizzle and all that. The kind of stuff that I don't. Now here's a question, Mark, which I don't know whether you want to take on this or not. Was there religious overtones to the hostilities, i.e., the troubles, I suppose?
So the hostility. Oh,
Yeah,
to the key co-op or to the movement generally, or
I think it might have been you mentioned to about Belfast scene. I think maybe.
oh right, there was yeah, I would say no, there wasn't. I would say the religious reaction, whether it was Catholic or Protestant, both considered veganism particularly to be a slap in the face of Christianity and to be a rejection of Christian values, sort of bizarrely. But to take a stand against animal suffering was seen, I think it's still often seen as being an anti-Christian stance, specifically perhaps an anti-Catholic stance. We have dominion and we have superiority over everything that crawls and flies and swims and walks on the earth. Dominion. And it's in Genesis, and Catholics and Christians always repeat this, and they quote the Bible, and they're right. The Bible does say that, and that's why we should reject the Bible. But it does say that we have dominion, that we are supreme. It's a form of it's the ultimate snobbery. It created a species of such snobs that we don't even consider ourselves to be animals. We are that disconnected psychologically from our roots, from reality, that a lot of people, a lot of Christians and Catholics do not consider themselves to be animals. So to treat animals with respect, I think they saw it as bringing humans down to the level of animals, and that was all wrong.
Denigration. It's the same with animal rights. Some people think it's a denigration of human rights, but you still get a lot of pushback to the idea that we're animals.
It's a lot less these days because it's such a dumb position. But I remember hearing it all the time when I was growing up. That we weren't. There was animals and there was us. It wasn't clear what us were if we weren't animals. It was never sort of delved into. But we weren't animals. Animals did their thing and we did our thing, and we were more like gods, really. I think.
Yeah, we were a divine creation. There's a good book called Unnatural Order by Jim Mason, and he's got a concept called dominionism, which is really good. Goes into that in a lot of detail.
Yeah. So as I say, it has poisoned our relationships with non-human animals ever since, and it is expressed in its rejection of things like veganism. So Seduced was the first short-lived vegan restaurant in Dublin. Nowadays, according to Happy Cow, when I checked, and this is as of mid-2023, there was 13 dedicated vegan restaurants and cafes in Dublin alone. So it's just blown up beyond all sort of imagination, really. No one, particularly the vegans in the 1980s and 90s, ever saw this coming. I mean, at least me, I didn't expect the movement to have such success in some spheres, as it has done. The availability and quality of vegan food in supermarkets and in restaurants has changed beyond all recognition from when I was a teenager. Now every restaurant or cafe that's worth its salt will have maybe even a dedicated vegan menu, whereas back in the old days, the only thing you could get was chips and a salad and a side plate of contempt, especially if you were out in the countryside. Nowadays, there's so much going on,
I guess there might still be the urban-rural divide, but even that has broken down a little bit.
It is fading. It is fading, and these guys are helping it fade. There's now a thing called a vegan butcher. There's a guy called Sova, he's a vegan butcher inside in Dublin there. Blazing Salads obviously have been on the scene for years. And they're pioneers as well. They've written a bunch of books on vegetarian cooking and vegan cooking, and so from the it really has blown up. Now for the next bit,
Mark, before we go on, we've gone 50 minutes. This might be a time maybe to.
I think you're right, because it goes into a very different sphere.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. If it goes into a different idea, just before we go. And in fact, we were going to talk about the definition of direct action, but we could do that next week because it's more relevant. But just before we go, what about you? What's your story, Mark?
Okay, so I've been very involved in animal rights since forever, really. I went vegetarian when I was about 13, and it was a very instinctual thing. I didn't grow up I grew up in a conservative Catholic family, city and country. Very Catholic dominated. I I go into the psychology of the country I grew up in quite a bit in the book, and I describe it as essentially a fascist type society. It was what fascist groups aspired to: highly Catholic, highly authoritarian, highly intolerant country. So out of that, despite all that, came a radical wing. Part of that was interested in animal rights. And when I became exposed to the punk movement, bands like Crass and Conflict, who were banging on about these issues really earnestly, and it really caught my ear, and I got really interested in the politics around animal rights. I became vegetarian when I was 13, just out of an emotional response. I think that I hadn't been exposed to anything. I didn't go into a slaughterhouse. I wasn't raised on a farm. It just seemed like a good idea. And then the politics of the anarcho-punk movement really impressed me, and I got involved in the movement then after being exposed to those records. Basically, a guy in school came in one day with a bag full of these albums, and I was pinned to the wall by the energy and the anger and the fury and all the rest of it. And I've been pinned to that wall since.
Even the covers of the Crash records,
yeah,
they're massive, yeah, didn't they? Yeah,
absolutely. So. The big fold-out posters and all that, and they in themselves were manifestos. The fold-out album covers. So it really blew my mind. For a person who was only exposed to Catholic Ireland type stuff, to be then exposed to Crass and their thinking, there's such diametrical ways of looking at the world. It was so enchanting as a young person, and I got really drawn to that. And so I got involved in the Irish Council Against Blood Sports, found them way too moderate and mild. There wasn't any movement worth its name really in Ireland at the time. When I moved to the UK in my mid-20s is when I really got involved in the Hunt Saboteurs. But when I was in Galway in the early 90s, I set up a Hunt Saboteurs group there as well. I had a bit experience going out a few times with the Scottish Sab, so I knew sort of what I was doing. So, so it started off in Ireland for a season of Hunt Sabotage. We had the shit kicked out of us, and then when I moved to the UK, it was a very different scene. It had been going on for about 35 years at that point. So the initial flurries of violence, to an extent, had sort of died down. Things were a bit more stable in terms of the dynamics between the local.
I think it depended where you were, but
it depends entirely where you were. Exactly,
you know,
and that could change in a dime.
Yeah, they almost came to accept the Sabs.
That's right. Yeah, they were part of the thing, and they'd say hello to you and all this. And I was so unused to this because the Irish sort of situation, it was so new there that you were surrounded by violence all the time. There wasn't any niceties or pretense to be civilized at all. So I was quite taken aback initially by the relationships between the local hunt and the Hunt Saboteurs. Obviously, as I say, that can turn. There was plenty of violence in the UK as well. In fact, there was people killed in the UK. So it's a big story. One that I can go into more detail next time, because we're coming into that.
Yes, indeed. And so so that's really kind of, you've created the kind of groundwork there for us, which is really brilliant. Okay, speaking of carnage, it's time for Mark. Welcome back, Mark. That was a bit mean of me, wasn't it?
It was quite a dramatic introduction. Still, will I go with that? Yeah, good. There is quite a bit of carnage ahead, actually. So.
Oh yeah. I suppose it's more relevant to this week than it was to last week. So, have you had a good week generally yourself?
Yes, it's been warming up here. The El Niño weather thing is beginning to kick in, and it's suddenly beginning to turn very, very warm and dry up here, down here. Yeah.
How can it be dry in a rainforest?
It can be. Yeah.
Yes.
I don't know.
Actually, it's funny, really, because rainforests you kind of associate with being so dense that maybe, does the water actually get to the bottom, or does it have to?
It does. Yeah. No. It's the thing about here is that the Waitakere Ranges, which is where I am, were completely devastated by loggers about a century ago. Up until about a century ago, when they suddenly realized that they had they suddenly noticed they had no trees left hardly. So there was a massive rewilding project done. So it's sort of first and second generation growth here. So most trees are still quite young, so therefore quite small. So no, it's quite a young forest. So the rain gets right down. It's really lush. But
yeah, so it's kind of what's the other word for it? Mature, I suppose. So it's not mature yet. So
that's right.
How long do you reckon that'll take?
Another few hundred years, I would say.
Oh, 100 years. Oh, right. Okay.
Yeah, it's a centuries long project. Yeah.
All right. Well. When it happens, send me a text and I'll have a look.
I'll send you some photographs. Yeah.
Okay. So we're coming into the vegan meaty part of your presentation, in the sense that this is the real kind of direct action part, isn't it?
Yeah, this is the 1980s and onwards. Yeah.
Yeah. So whenever you're ready, you're quite happy to go. I'm quite happy to let you go.
Okay, we can dive in now. I'll just do a brief summary of the last interview. Sort of covered the area really from largely from 1822 till about the late 1970s, I would say. And
right, so that's our part one. So if
that's part one, yeah, and that covers the initial legal efforts by the likes of Trigger Martin to push through the Cruelty to Cattle Act in 1822, and from there on there was a gradual extension of the interpretation of sentient life and wanton cruelty.
Yeah. Well, I remember you talking about Trigger Martin and his private prison, and in fact,
yes.
It must have made an impression, because Dennis Nealis from Sentient Rights Island posted that on Facebook. Whoa, look at this, the first animal abuse prison, yes.
Right, I must have a look, because when I went to look on Google Maps, it was really vague, and I couldn't really see any details. So yeah, that should be it should be a monument, really. There should be a plaque saying that there. I don't know if there is or not, but it is a very significant place, really.
Yeah, well, I'm going to try and track down that plaque you mentioned on
Henry Street, on 21 Henry Street. Yeah, it's on the side of the wall there by what is now maybe a health food store, like pills and all that sort of health food store. Yeah,
that kind of one. Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So all that, folks, was part one, and this then from now on is part two.
This is part two. So from here on in, we're covering sort of the 1980s onwards, and this area is going to cover the rise of the Animal Liberation Front. So if could you call up the slides there, Roger? Here we go. Yeah, that's it. So, okay. So first of all, to explain where I sourced all the information from, it's all publicly available information from across a range of media. So a lot of the mainstream media going right back via the Irish newspaper archives, which is where I got a lot of the information for episode 1 as well. But I also triangulated the information with the animal rights movement's publications of the time as well. So you had the likes of the Animal Liberation Front supporters group Diary of Actions, whose editors kept getting busted and imprisoned generally for incitement and things like that. So there was a rolling editorial team there involved, and that publicized actions by the ALF around the world, including Ireland. And then there was, of course, Howl, which is the quarterly magazine of the Hunt Saboteurs Association, which is still in print. It's been in print since 1973, and they have an archive on the Hunt Saboteurs Association website as well. So I read through basically every issue of Howl, of the Diary of Actions from the ALF supporters group, of every other associated sort of militant or quasi-militant animal rights group, and anything to do with animal rights or the ALF or the Hunt Saboteurs in any Irish newspaper ever in print. And also
a couple of points on that, Mark. It's quite interesting, because I've always not really liked the title Howl for the HSA thing, because it stands for Hounds Off Our Wildlife, doesn't it? And I don't like the idea. I mean, from an animal rights point of view, the free living beings, they belong to themselves. So the idea of it being ours is a problem.
It sort of stems back from the very embryonic beginnings of the animal liberation, animal rights movement back in this. So it's the early 1970s. So I think it's sort of a bit of a hangover from that. I didn't know that it stood for Hands Off for Wildlife until about 10 years ago, and I've been involved in the saboteurs for years and years.
Oh, okay.
I'd always neglected to read the little
and then the second point, you said that the editors of the ALFSG
Yeah.
were kind of under scrutiny. But then again,
Yeah.
if you look at the screen, devastate to liberate. If you're going to,
I know they really pushed the envelope here. They were really, again, it was the early days of the movement. Here's a typical.
Do you know what their really famous front page was Learn to Burn? You remember that one?
Learn to Burn. I think I've let me see. Here we see Butcher's hit by. It really probably glorified the direct action and striking back and so on. It was a very provocative, very insightful magazine. There is a similar sort of diary of actions website now called Unoffensive Animal, and it's a lot less provocative, shall we say. It's more sort of
less incendiary,
less insightful. So I think they learned their lessons over the years. But you can see here the diary of actions on the left here was probably a 4 or 5 or 6 page bulletin produced every sort of 3-4 months, listing hundreds of actions from all around the world. It was quite in the 80s and 90s. The ALF was at its zenith, and it really shows in the tone of the publications and the frequency and the amount of actions going on. So let's go back a bit here. I also sourced it from Sabotage, which is the information from Sabotage, which is a Hunt Saboteurs Association book that they released for their 50th anniversary some years back. From Dusk Till Dawn, which is Keith Mann's book. He was banged up for 14 years, I think, for arson or attempted arson.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And he spent a lot of that time either on the run or writing this book From Dusk Till Dawn, which is a huge, big tome, and it goes into the history of the ALF, principally in the UK. So I got a lot of information from that. And then, of course, the last two here, Outfoxed Again and Outfoxed by Mike Huskisson, who infiltrated the various hunters groups during the 70s and 80s, posing as a hunter and getting information on film and as witness to what they were really up to. So this is where I source my information. It's all publicly available, and everything I list here is the stuff that made it to the news. So it's the least of what has happened. It may represent the most of what has happened, but it isn't all of what has happened. A lot of really small scale actions, I would imagine, never made it to any media. So the stuff I could find in newspapers or in animal rights magazines, anything and everything I could find, I listed. So here we have, this is on the front page of one of the Evening Herald, I think. So again, during there was a rise during the 80s and 90s of the Animal Liberation Fronts in the UK, and in Ireland, they sort of rose to prominence during the early mid 1980s. And there was a few principal sort of areas of operation, and one of them was the coursing debate, where they would go in and put glass or threaten to put glass shards of glass on a field that was to be used the following day for a coursing event, and that would slow the proceedings down or would intimidate the farmer that owned that field out of being involved in coursing or whatever. Spiking products or pretending to have spiked products was a thing that carried over from the Mars bar hoax in the UK, which was really successful in terms of the damage caused. Food poisoning hoax. There was a few food poisoning hoax. Lots of smashing of butchers' windows seemed to be a huge thing during the 80s and 90s. It was going on all over the place. Dublin also quite recently saw the first open lobster rescue from a Chinese shop in the city centre, and the lobsters were brought to the sea, I believe.
Just down the road from Cornucopia, that
was it. Okay, right. So you can see here, most of these, if not all of these, are headlines from various Irish media, mainstream media, of stuff the ALF are doing. Gardaí act to break terror squad. So they were causing such a ruckus around them that the police set up their own special squad, the same as they did in the UK with Arnie. It never had a name like that. It was just the Animal Liberation Squad or something like that. I don't think they arrested anyone at all. This particular Garda squad. There was some arrests up in the north of Ireland of some ALF activists who served a bit of time for it. But down in the south, there's only a record of 2 people being arrested in Waterford and being fined £30 each at the time. So, so if you just go back into the origins of the ALF here, and that's going to go back to, it's going to go over to the United Kingdom, to this chap in the middle here, who Roger might recognize.
No, we need a content warning for that.
Yeah. This is Ronnie Lee, co-founder, principal founder, I would say, of the Animal Liberation Front, formerly the Band of Mercy. So, the whole thing came out of the Hunt Saboteurs Association. The small groups of militants were meeting in groups like the Hunt Saboteurs and deciding to take things to a new level and vandalize empty vehicles owned by hunts as they were off hunting on quiet country lanes. They'd leave the air out of the tires, they'd smash the windscreen and stuff like this. And that expanded to taking on the vivisection industry. And on the left here, you see a partially burnt boat from the Wash. It was destined to be used on a seal hunt, and that was put out of action. And the seal hunt was abandoned from then on. And that was a very early Band of Mercy action with immediate success. It closed down that seal hunt that had been operating for years. And on the right here, we see a note left by the Band of Mercy claiming responsibility for an arson attack on a building site of an animal lab.
Yeah, you know, Ronnie still can't write any better than that.
Yes, that's been done clearly with one of those stencil set things, you know.
Yeah.
They're all the rage. So the significance of a note like this can't be underestimated. It's the first, or one of the first, declarations of war on the animal abuse industries, I suppose you could say. First of its kind. It heralds a new liberation movement, and clumsy as it's written, it's highly significant. It's the first of its kind. It's a real. I was really happy to come across that and to be able to include it. Of course, the very first bands of mercies were these guys here, who were groups of kids, usually between the ages of 5 and 15. They were huge in the United States, particularly. They were tied in with the Christian revivalist movement, the alcohol abstention movement, and also the animal welfare movement. And they'd go around singing songs about taking care of animals. Apparently, sometimes some of them used to damage hunters' guns. But that wasn't part of the formal Band of Mercy philosophy. They were sort of they would go around promoting the idea of being kind to animals by singing songs and by acting as exemplars. And they were absolutely huge in the United States at the turn of the 20th century. About 3% of all kids aged between 5 and 15 were members of Bands of Mercies, of chapters of Bands of Mercies. There was thousands of chapters around the US in particular, and it was big in the UK as well. So that gave the inspiration to Ronnie Lee and some of his cohorts at the time to set up their own Band of Mercy, and that developed into the Animal Liberation Front.
Going back to the Band of Mercy, Mark.
Yeah.
I know that Ronnie was inspired because they it was a time when that kind of like a little offshoot from the RSPCA was quite militant, but you're kind of suggesting it wasn't. I mean, so where did the militancy image come from?
There's a book that Ronnie has read that indicates the sabotage of hunters' property. I couldn't find any evidence of this. There's hardly anything written online about the Band of Mercy. There's maybe 4 or 5 paragraphs in total, and it only talks about their evangelizing sort of singing and going around and propagandizing, but it didn't mention anything about sabotage there. But there is a book that I couldn't find anywhere online to read, but I know that Ronnie has some information on this indicating it, but I couldn't find my own proof of it, so I didn't want to emphasize it too much.
I showed Ronnie that picture once and asked him which one of those kids was him.
Is he the guy in the middle? The small guy in the middle?
Yeah. I think he said that himself, I think.
before he had glasses and all that. So then Ronnie and Cliff Goodman got caught as they were about to set fire to a laboratory and sentenced to a few years in prison, or 18 months or so. And when they got out, Cliff Goodman had had enough and hung up his balaclava. Ronnie didn't, and doubled down and helped set up what became the Animal Liberation Front, who kicked off in the sort of mid to late 70s. And initially, a lot of the stuff was centered around rescuing animals from vivisection and adjacent industries. It evolved into arson attacks, the Mars bar poisoning hoax. They really upped the ante during the late 70s into the 80s. Where they were responsible actually for some of the largest fires seen in Britain since the Luftwaffe in World War II.
Yeah,
so
could you maybe for the audience, could you tell could you tell the story of the Dingles fire that you had in the last
Sure.
slide there?
The Dingles fire here it's representative of, during the mid to late 80s, there was a campaign against the fur trade. In the research I've done, it's probably one of the most effective animal rights campaigns probably of that time. And probably one of the reasons for that was because there was such a multitude of tactics. It was sort of, there was above and below ground tactics being used. There was groups like Lynx and Greenpeace and Sea Shepherd and so on, who were highlighting the cruelty of, say, the Canadian seal cull by going up there with cameras and recording it and then getting it shown on the BBC, etc. And then at the other end of the spectrum, there was the likes of the Animal Liberation Front, who had developed these incendiary devices that would fit inside an empty packet of cigarettes, and they would be placed into the top floor of a department store that was selling fur somewhere in it. With timing devices, it was timed to go off sometime in the middle of the night, and the idea was that it would spit out some flame, start a small fire, produce a small amount of smoke, and trigger off the sprinkler systems that all these department stores had by law. But what happens, of course, if you do this and the sprinkler system isn't working or is turned off, then the fire spreads. And in a few cases, it wasn't the sprinkler system that turned on and created all the damage by water damage. It was the fires that got out of control and burnt these places to the ground. And some of them were out of operation for years. And none of them resumed selling.
I've always argued, that in terms of Dingles, the ALF were quite likely to have maybe saved human lives there, because if that fire had started in the daytime, not by the incendiaries, but just a fire, and the sprinklers weren't working, it would have been devastation.
That's right.
And just for this comment, yes, Elliot, we're actually live, so if you want to ask a question, Mark will answer it live for you if that's what you're getting at.
And then with the Mars bar poisoning hoax, that was in 1984, I think, when the ALF claimed to have put alpha kill, a type of rat poison, commercially available rat poison at the time. They claimed that they had spiked random Mars bars around the country and placed them back onto the shelves of shops. They'd spiked them with rat poison in protest against funding for the owner of Mars were funding research into tooth decay on monkeys. Obviously, the best advice if you want to avoid tooth decay is to not eat things like Mars bars. But so it was seemed to be a very cynical move on their part to be doing this, and obviously highly exploitative of the monkeys involved. So the ALF decided to go straight for the jugular, claimed they had poisoned random Mars bars all around the country, sent in an example of 2 poisoned Mars bars. Apparently, these were the only 2 that were actually poisoned. So when these were sent into the media or to the police, and they were analyzed, and there was poison found in them, and it scared the bejesus out of Mars and the government, and the media went ape on this. And obviously, it was all bad press, but it was press. And Mars withdrew their funding for the animal research. they didn't sell their sale of Mars bars slumped to zero, I think, for 10 days, and it took about 10 weeks for it to climb back to normal sales. They had to employ 1,000 people to remove every Mars bar from every shop in the UK. It took them about a week or something. I mean, it caused chaos, and it was a hoax.
We were doing stalls in Liverpool at the time, and
how did the public react to that? Was there any?
Well, it was quite interesting because, you know, the Liverpudlians, you know, the Scouse humour. Some guy came up and he goes, "You haven't got any Mars bars, have you, mate?" And I said, "No, sorry, we're right out of them." You know, so they took it rather well, really. But
yeah, there was so obviously it's a very belligerent, maybe scary thing to claim to have done. You know, they as I say, they admitted it was a hoax about a week later. Because it was so effective, there was copycat hoaxes of things like Sunsilk shampoo in Ireland and the UK, coordinated a few months later, I think, and there was a smattering more of food poisoning hoaxes around that time, following on from the Mars bar hoax in the UK and Ireland, sometimes nationwide, sometimes coordinated between Ireland and the UK.
Yeah, I think Lucasade was one, wasn't it, Mark? Lucasade?
It was the Lucasade one, that's right. There was Sunsilk, there was Lucasade, and there was a few other things that were poisoned along the way. Generally in protest against those particular companies like Wella.
Yeah, I didn't know there was any in Ireland at all until I.
There was a few in Ireland. Yeah, there was. Some group claimed they'd poisoned turkeys or something in the run up to Christmas, I think. And I got a little bit of media attention, a few paragraphs that I'd come across, but nothing on the scale of the Mars bar reaction. So an action like this obviously depends entirely on a gullible media to sort of spread your word.
It was a time when Ronnie was really, really busy. The Mars bar thing, you know, I mean, like, you got the influencers talking about being on the media and everything, but like, he was on just about every news show every hour for a few days.
I remember seeing when I was really young.
How the heck did they find only 2 poisoned Mars bars? Because they
were posted. The poisoned Mars, the only 2 Mars bars that had any poison in them were the ones that were posted to, I think it was the media, like the Times over in the UK or something like this, with letters attached saying this is an example of what we've done all around the country. But it wasn't. It was the hoax. It was just to get talking about it. It turned out so highly effective, but the media copped on and stopped, it seemed, and then stopped talking about it either at all or anywhere near as much, and with anywhere near as much sort of hype as the Mars bar event.
I think what happened also is that some Mars bars, they were kind of the packet was injected. Yeah, you know, so it looked like that's right.
That's right. Like the sealing was pierced and stuff. The wrapping had been pierced as if they had been injected or potentially injected with something. But so there was a whole lot of this going on to make it look real, and it was revealed to be the big hoax it was then. So during the 80s and 90s, particularly the 80s, the Animal Liberation Front in particular were going wild around the UK and were having some success over in Ireland. I would say that the whole thing really petered out from about 2010 onwards. There's been hardly any actions anywhere around the world. I mean, there's places like Mexico and Chile that seem to have fairly active groups there, but in the Western world, if you want to call it that, it's really died a slow death, really. Many reasons for that. One would be the ubiquity of CCTV and the increased surveillance just generally everywhere, better forensics from the police, arrests and some massively long sentences, particularly over in the UK with Keith Mann and the guy that died in hunger strike, Barry Horn, getting 18 years, I think. So that put a lot of people off, and massive state infiltration, of course, which only came to light relatively recently, led principally by this guy. These 2 photographs on the right here. This guy is the guy who Bob Lambert is his name, aka Bob Robinson, and he's the guy who literally wrote the manual, wrote the book on police undercover, the nefarious world, the really dark and dirty world of police, the special police squads that were going undercover into almost entirely left-wing groups from the 1960s onwards. Bob Lambert was one of the main players here. He managed to infiltrate an arson cell of the ALF who were setting fire to department stores, the likes of Dingles that we were talking about. He managed to worm his way into a small ALF arson cell. And there's allegations including by an MP, by Caroline Lucas, that he actually planted an incendiary device in a Debenhams in, I think it might have been Luton, and the sprinkler system wasn't working and it burnt the store, or there was loads of water damage to the store. I'm not too sure, but either way, it was a successful operation that he took part in. The other two people who took part in it got 3 and 4 years each in prison. Bob Lambert here got promotion for doing the exact same thing. And he wrote this, the Tradecraft Manual. Their tagline is by any means necessary, and they meant it. These guys were going in, they were starting relationships with women, most of whom had very little or no involvement in any of the groups that they were spying on. They were just being used as a mask, essentially. And in at least 4 cases, they had kids with these people. They had children. I think in one case, one guy had 2 kids with one activist. And Bob Lambert set the pace for all this. On the extreme right here he is holding his son that he fathered with a woman, Jackie, who he betrayed and tricked into thinking her into thinking that he was a gardener and an activist. In fact, he was a cop. He was using her to gain access to other people who he wanted to spy on, basically. I think he was with her for 4 or 5 years. His son that he's holding in his arms here and the mother of his son both sued him a couple of years back for various things, and they both got about £500,000 each from the state for psychological damages and so on. So no one in the animal movement, I would say, knew how deep this penetration went. There was dozens of spies.
Well, here's a couple of questions for you, Mark, both from Deb. Is the LF still pretty active in places like Sweden, Denmark, and Norway?
I think there's occasional actions to do with the fur farm, fox fur, particularly in places like that, but not that much. It's been sporadic in those places. Yeah, there was. I do recall seeing regular enough actions in the diary of actions from particularly Sweden during the 80s and 90s. But as with most other places in Europe, it's really dwindled since around the mid 2010s, about 2010 onwards. There's been a lot less there.
There's still some mink farm liberations in the United States, but it's the it's the most controversial of the ALF activities.
That's right. That's right.
So that's one. And then Deb says the police infiltrated, fathered these kids.
Yeah, they did. Yeah, they did. Yeah, they fathered these kids. It's awful. There's a really good book called Undercover by 2 Guardian journalists, and it's excellent. It really goes into detail. Some went native, some went crazy, some had kids. It's unbelievable. They make the East German Stasi look like peeping toms.
Yeah, wasn't their tactic to kind of get out of the relationship? Didn't they kind of fake some kind of trauma or mental breakdown?
That's right. Yeah. The targeted woman would wake up one morning and there'd be a note on the breakfast table saying, "I couldn't take it anymore. I've had enough. I've gone to Spain for 6 months, or so I need to get some time out, or my uncle is sick and I've got to go back to Australia," or something like this. And all of a sudden they are gone, and that's it. It's their end of duty. They're told by their handlers, okay, you've got to terminate this relationship next week by any means necessary, and the usual format. They all followed a very, very similar format. I assume that's changed now because that format's publicly known. But the format was that they would turn up at an activist meeting. They would usually have a van and a clean license, which was very rare among activists those days.
It might have changed in terms of going things like online now. But if Deb, if you want to read about this, you can look at the Spy Cops website.
Podcast, and there's a podcast of Spy Cops as well.
Yeah,
Goes through in detail.
See, one of the women who kind of outed herself to use a real name was Helen Steele. I used to know Helen from when she was in London Greenpeace.
Yeah.
And you know, she was tricked, and she actually went around the world looking for, you know,
she found them.
Yeah,
John Dines.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah. And so an interesting movement issue, actually, Mark, is that about 3 weeks ago, because Ronnie and I covered it a few days ago, one of the new kind of influencers thought that they'd uncovered a spy, but maybe a corporate spy rather than a police spy. But they had no idea of this history.
It's crazy, isn't it?
Yeah. And it goes to show, you know, if you don't know the history of the movement you're in, you're going to get a distorted image of it.
That's right, and it'll happen again. The same pitfalls will occur again. Do you know what John Dines is doing now, Roger?
No, I don't think so.
He's working in Australia for the Australian police, teaching the Indian police how to infiltrate left-wing groups in India. That's his job. Yeah. So
left-wing groups in India, but
there are actually, yeah. There's a movement there called the Naxalites, and I think they're yeah. So the guy has just moved around, and he's doing the same thing in the Southern Hemisphere now.
Yeah, one of the cops, I do know that one of the cops just cut his hair, had a shave, and he went back to his station, which is just around the corner from his victim, and she didn't know. Because he looked so different and everything.
Yeah.
I mean, talk about ruthless, you know.
Yeah. Oh God, yeah. There was no mercy at all, really. I mean, the cynicism, and the damage that they inflicted on these people. You know, it was awful, absolutely awful. No one would have guessed that the state were that interested in people like them, or the movement generally back in the day. I think if someone had whispered in your ear, you know, that guy over there, the guy that's had a baby with so-and-so, he's actually a cop and all that, no one would have thought it plausible. But there it was, you know.
Yeah, there's a couple of things that came up in the Sheffield trial, which was kind of like, oh, really, you know, but you could never be true, because you know, you can never be sure about these things. That's right. That's the problem. You know, they can just cast a bit of doubt, and then nobody kind of really knows, really, in the end.
Right. So, yeah. So moving on to coursing and its discontent. So coursing was the sort of touchstone, really, for the very beginnings of what you might call the proactive. I'm sort of afraid of using the word militant animal rights, because militancy usually involves death and guns and stuff. There has been no similar group in the animal rights. The ALF cause economic damage and vandalize and so on and so forth, but they don't threaten people or they don't harm people. So they aren't really a militant group in that sense, but I'll use that word loosely in connection with the sort of the civil disobedience end of the animal rights movement, should we say. So it started off here in the north of Ireland with the Queen's University Belfast Anti-Blood Sport Society, and they stepped in. The previous, the spikiest group taking on coursing at the time was something called the Anti-Coursing League, and their methods were having silent vigils outside of coursing stadiums, just a few people sort of standing around a candle, basically, and that was deemed to be fairly ineffective. And these guys, these students came in, and they were taking inspiration from what they were seeing. This is the very early 80s. They were inspired by the suffragette movement, by the US civil rights movements, the Martin Luther King style of civil disobedience, massive but passive, stuff like that. Here they are blockading the entrance to the Creebelly coursing festival, which was held at a greyhound racing track outside Belfast every year. So this was the start. This is the very first public showing of civil disobedience in the name of animal rights in Ireland that is in recorded history. And it got a lot of media attention because of its novelty. And it was repeated a number of times over the next sort of 18 months or so. And here we see an activist being carried off a field. Again, the idea was to disrupt and cause disorder and sabotage, and by doing blockades and sit-ins. So it it was peaceful, but it was provocative and disruptive. Definitely.
One of the most dangerous things that people can do go up against the coursers because they're really violent.
These guys love violence, right? That's why they're into coursing. So I would say terrier men on fox hunts and coursers are probably two of the most vile and violent demographic people I've ever come across. Very, very quick with their fists, right? Here they are again. People are trying to break through lines in the RUC, obviously the Royal Ulster Constabulary at the time, now the PSNI, were par excellence at crowd control. This is the early 1980s in the north of Ireland, just outside Belfast. These guys were used to dealing with massive disruption in the cities with the civil war that was going on there. So nonetheless, the anti-blood sports guys were able to break through the lines of police and do sit-downs and get dragged off again. Again, this is the Creevalley Coursing Club, which was the epicenter of the beginning of the civil disobedience / militant animal rights movements in Ireland. It spread south, and a common tactic at the time, and I remember reading it about it a lot in the Evening Echo and the Cork Examiner as a kid, activists would claim they had or would actually spread brass tacks, sometimes painted green, this grass green color, and thrown all over the field that was designated as a coursing field for the following day or whatever. And this would mean that the farmers and the coursers would have to comb through the field and take all the glass or the tacks off the field before the coursing could begin. Obviously, it's quite a maybe an incongruous method of protecting wildlife, you know, through throwing broken glass around the field. But the point was that they were doing this in the knowledge that all the glass or tacks would have to be removed if the field was going to be viable for anything, for the farmer or for the coursers.
Well, obviously they wouldn't care about the hares, but they would care about the hounds, wouldn't they?
Yeah. So
and to say intimidating landowners, don't you think?
Pardon?
It's a bit of a stretch to say that was an intimidation of landowners, you would think. I mean, it's an inconvenience, isn't it, really?
It's an inconvenience, and it slowed things down, and it made headlines. And there was a few people a few landowners did refuse to put on future coursing events and publicly declared so after a number of these attacks. I think they had enough of it. So it had some effects. It sort of highlighted the issue. I think the activists were at a bit of a loss as to how to best approach this, and maybe throwing tacks and glass wasn't the best thing, but it was what was done, and it's what's in the history books. Another thing, there was a guy, particularly a guy called John Fitzgerald, I think his name was. He was involved in the Anti-Blood Sports Society or some group like this. He was accused of sending this note here that we see bits of, saying we're going to petrol bomb your house the same as we did at Ballyraggard and all these different places. And it's he was accused of sending these letters to dozens of farmers around the Cork area, pressuring them to withdraw from coursing. Some did, and the police raided his house and claimed to have found a load of similar letters that were ready to be posted out. He claims that the police planted these letters in his property, and eventually it was thrown out of court. But it was the first accusation of police corruption in this, and in dealing with animal rights activists, or police collusion and so on.
Yeah, do you think that's a little bit like Alan Newbury Street? You know, I mean, like there was that thing where he planted a nail bomb on his own Land Rover.
Yes, that's right. Yes, that's right. Yeah. To bring a lot of negative attention to the cause, if you like. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. There was the Master McGrath on the left here. We see these locals that are clearing up the Master McGrath statue, which is a statue to a famous coursing hound from the late 19th century, I think. And there's a statue to him. It's a pro-coursing statue. It's been attacked by the ALF on a number of occasions, and then subsequently cleaned by locals. The ALF have poured tar and paint over it and smashed it up on a few occasions. In the middle here, we see I think it was the Dungannon. It's a really bad photograph from a newspaper, but it shows the burnt-out remains of a coursing stadium in the north of Ireland that the ALF set fire to. And then there's more anti-blood sports protesters here trying to get through. Again, this is up in the north of Ireland, had the most prolific activists really throughout this period. Up top here, we see this Catholic Animal Welfare Society protesting with the Irish Council Against Blood Sports outside Clonmel police station, accusing the Clonmel police of colluding with local blood sports enthusiasts to put pressure on the likes of this guy down here, who was arrested on a number of occasions. He's he was the head of the Irish Council Against Blood Sports. His name is Pat Phelan, and clearly not an ALF activist, but he kept on being arrested and held for questioning for like 24-hour periods and stuff over recent ALF attacks during the 90s, the 1980s and 90s. Despite always condemning anything ALF in the area, the police had no one else to go on. I think there wasn't really any movement here as such in Ireland at that time to spy on the way there was in the UK. So they were grasping at straws, and they kept on arresting Pat Phelan and the secretary of the ICABs and accusing them of doing all these things.
Something to do. Going back to the statue, is that still there? You know, the
as far as I know, it's still there. Yeah, it's outside Waterford, I think, Waterford or Wexford, some small town. It's the Master McGrath statue. It's quite famous.
Right.
Yeah. I'd never heard about it before until I'd again.
I'll have a look on Google Maps.
Next time you're passing through.
Yeah.
And then we go on to, of course, the mighty Hun saboteurs. That's me on the far right here. I'm actually blowing my nose as I'm just about to help my fellow saboteur Alan here, who's being dragged off private land at a Hun Sab with the Vale of Aylesbury, which I think Ronnie leaves to sabotage way back in the day. So let's go into the Hun saboteurs.
But that's a terrible narrative, Mark. You could say that you were calling the hounds off or something.
I know. I was being really honest here. You can see I've got a handkerchief against my nose and everything. I could say that actually. In fact, I will say that in future. I'm shouting at someone. Now, the very first recorded Hun sabotage didn't happen in the United Kingdom. It happened in a small village outside Limerick called Brewery, and it was organized by this guy up here who was a priest called Father Eugene Sheehy, who was organizing a campaign against the guy below him, the local landlord of the area, a guy called John Gubbins, who was a keen fox hunter as well. And John Gubbins had threatened to evict a number of families from his land. So Father Sheehy organized a sort of a boycott against Gubbins. So anytime that Gubbins and his crew tried to go out fox hunting during the season, I think it was of 1883, this was, Father Sheehy would gather up the local lads who were part of the GAA hurling team, and they would blockade the path of the fox hunters, and the fox hunters would just turn back. So it would have looked something like on the bottom right here, a whole load of guys all wearing their GAA sweaters, carrying their Hurleys, which are also weapons in sort of wrong hands.
You wouldn't want to get in the way of them.
You wouldn't want to get on the wrong side of a Hurley. And they would blockade. So for the entire hunting season of 1883 or 1888 or whatever it was, these guys were stopped from going out. This is the first recorded evidence of Hun sabotage. It wasn't done in the name of animal rights. It was done in the name of tenants' rights, and it was part of the Land League sort of campaign. But they were so effective that by the end of the season, Gubbins sold his horse and the fox hunt disbanded. So the very first recorded fox hunt, and it was immediately successful. And as an aside, Eamon de Valera, the godfather of Irish republicanism, apparently is the bastard offspring of John Gubbins. Eamon de Valera's mum used to work as a servant in Gubbins' house before emigrating to America and giving birth to de Valera. And there is a rumor, I don't know how much weight to put on this, but there is a rumor that I found online that John Gubbins, the very first victim of the Hun saboteurs, was the father of Eamon de Valera, one of the principal figures of
that's it, folks. You tune into the Vegan Time Tunnel for all the latest gossip.
So there you go. I mean, it's wheels within wheels here. I couldn't get over the interconnections between all these histories, really. So whether
what's
it's
the deal
true,
with the Native American headdress?
he was receiving an award from an American Indian tribe. I forget which one. I'm not too sure why they were honoring him, but they had him put on their headdress and did a powwow ceremony around him, and he gave a
Look like
speech.
they were arresting him, doesn't it?
Yeah. So yeah, it was just this stunning photograph that I came across. I could have put up one of the more generic images of De Valera, but I came across this and I thought, this is
that's going in.
Yeah. So, but the very start of the modern day hunt sabotage movement began with Gwen Barter, who I describe as the Rosa Parks of the animal rights movement. Rosa Parks obviously being the woman who refused to give up her seat on the bus in Montgomery down in Alabama way back in the 1950s or 60s or whenever it was, sparking the bus boycott and the civil rights movement of that era that was led by Martin Luther King. So that began with Rosa Parks refusing to give up her seat. The hunt sabotage movement began when Gwen Barter sat on the bonnet of the lead vehicle of this group of staghounds hunters here and refused to move. And they just turned around and went home.
You
and she
wouldn't
did it
get
again
away
about
with that
6
nowadays, would you, Mark?
No, they would keep driving these days.
They would, yeah.
Or from any point shortly after this time on, they didn't know what to do. Here's a middle-aged lady sitting on the bonnet. There's media around, and they just didn't know what to do really. So they turned around, went home. She did the same thing a few months later. So did the hunters. They just turned around and went home. And people were looking at this with keen interest, including these guys here. These guys up in the top here are the guys who started. John Prestige on the right here, blowing the horn. He was the guy. He witnessed the end of a stag hunt in a village in Devon, and it so disgusted him that he decided to start up what became the Hunt Saboteurs Association, to take on these bastards who feel privilege over the bodies of other animals to the point where they can have them torn in half, and they smear the blood of these victims onto the faces of their own kids. I mean, these guys are borderline psychopaths, I would say. So the Hunt Sabotage movement was galvanized in response to the outrageous behavior of these people.
Yeah, it's called blooding, isn't it, Mark? Because I remember going to a pony meet once in Essex, and for some there was one kid on a pony, and he was kind of doing weird things with his head, and we realized that he was showing us that he'd been blooded because he had streaks of blood, on his face.
Right. It's quite sick, yeah. Borderline child abuse, I would say. So the Hunt Saboteur movement began in reaction to this. And it quickly became more and more organized. Initially, tactics were haphazard. One of the preferred tactics was throwing chunks of meat to the hounds before the hunt started, to distract them and to fill them up, because they're often starved for a day or two before they go out hunting.
Not the best vegan tactic.
No, it isn't really, is it? And it quickly died out. And it was replaced with tactics like the gizmo, which is a taped recording of the hounds on cry. Here on the left, you see 3 Sherpa vans full of saboteurs following this one hunt supporter on his way to lead them to the meet. He's unknowingly doing their work for them by driving them to the meet.
Towing them.
Yeah.
Actually, I've never seen that picture of Ronnie before.
Yeah, I don't know where I came across it. It was some obscure publication, and I had to put it up. There he is. He looks in his early 20s, and beside him is Dave Wetton, another stalwart of the Hunt Saboteur movement from years back, running across the field, sabotaging the Oxfordshire Coursing Club. I guess they're running onto the coursing club field there and causing disruption that way. So yeah, it began it really sort of kicked off. It began in the 1960s, but it began to really kick off in the 70s, and then particularly the 80s. And up top here, you see saboteurs following a beagling pack who are on foot. So it's much easier to keep up with them, and they're in much closer proximity to you. You see on both pictures here, you're walking right beside them. So the potential for violence at these things, it's always there. You know, you're going out and you're spoiling their day, and rightfully so. But as far as they're concerned, you're just screwing up their fun. and they can get annoyed and they can lash out. And
these are the guys who wore the green coats and not the red ones, isn't it?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, and you got the beige guys up here. I mean, they have the little uniforms and the little white tights. And of course, as I say, violence was never far away. And whilst the first few saboteurs were met with sort of a bemused bewilderment, really, and a withdrawal of the hunters, after they got over their surprise, the violence came pretty quickly. And of course, they always had their own private security firm, aka the police, who were there to do basically anything that they were told to do by the hunt. They were on call the same as the hounds were a lot of the times. And you would see these posh guys on horses directing the police to do this and do that. And the police often would, you know, they would act as their little minions, and it was disgusting. On the very bottom left here, you see, I forget his name, but he's the master of foxhounds over in Waterford now. And there he is with a shotgun. He had pulled out a shotgun. This is during the 1970s, and shot a van that had saboteurs in it. He had shot the bonnet of a Sherpa van, as it still contained saboteurs. He was given a 3-month suspended sentence, and that was it. You can guarantee if a saboteur turned up with a shotgun and shot a hunter's vehicle, they would get more than 3 months suspended sentence.
Yeah, so the real problem in those days was that the magistrates were hunters, weren't they? So.
That's right. Yeah. So you were there was a real a lot of the media hated the hunt saboteurs. The police were very hostile. The legal system, the courts, and the magistrates were often connected with the hunt, as you say. And so they were really up against it, but they persevered.
Now, Mark, before you leap on, and sorry to keep interrupting you, but I think you've got 20 slides left, and we're up to 55 minutes. So, do you want to continue, or would you want to come back and do proper diligence with them? It's up to you, really.
If it's up to me, I wouldn't mind coming back to it, Roger, because there's quite a bit more to go, and I do talk on about this. And it's
probably my fault for interrupting you too much. But are you talking about next week?
Yes, I am. I mean, I could do the same time. I could do the same time next week. And if that's all right with you, I don't want to dominate your schedule with all of this.
No, dominate away. Don't worry about that.
Okay. In that case,
slide 56, and there's 75 altogether, isn't there?
Yes, that's right. Yeah. So we should get through it with one more session, and it gets really. I mean, it's a very interesting and exciting and human story. So
this is where people can buy the actual book version of this.
That's right. Yeah. It's available now.
Most of these images are in the book. Is that right?
That's right. Plus more. So some of these are Pulitzer Prize winning images. A lot of budding young photojournalists would ask to come out with the hunt saboteurs, hoping to catch some sort of drama on a bit of black and white film, and they often did, and won prizes as a result. There are some amazing images in my book, in the Sabotage book by the Hunt Saboteurs Association. So there's lots more to come, and this is the beginning of the sort of real violent period during the late 80s, I suppose, when saboteurs were killed and so on. There's Deb, one of our regulars. I really enjoy Mark explaining the slides in detail. So that's a vote for you to come back, and probably a warning for me to shut up next week, I would think. So, but okay. So that's where you can go. And so the book is still. Is this pre-sales or is it? That's right. It's pre-order. It'll be available. It's being actually published and launched on the 4th of December, which is World Wildlife Conservation Day, and it'll be available from Amazon, Waterstones, Barnes and Noble, all good bookshops, plus the publishers themselves, who are Earth Island Books, and you can order it now from them.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Mr. Grumpy. There's quite a lot of grumpy vegans, isn't there? Good stuff. Watching over my breakfast in New Zealand. No rainforest in my neighborhood.
Okay.
So, there you go. Some more planting to be done. Hey, Mark, I tried to get rid of you early there. Sorry about that. So,
I don't know.
yeah. So how's your rainforest?
It's beautiful. It's summertime almost here, and it's great.
Excellent, excellent. Okay, a friend of yours is in the chat, Bernie
Hi,
Wright,
Bernie.
Mark. So that's quite good. We've got Philip from New York,
Mm.
and Linda. Hello, Linda, and Deb is in the house as well. So welcome as we all kind of pile in. I was going to ask you actually, Mark, about the title of the book.
Sure.
Is there a kind of, well, was there a trigger for it? Should I say that?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I wanted to like avoid a really obvious title for the book. There's been previous books written about similar issues in different countries with names like Free the Animals, or there's one about Ronnie Lee called The Animals Freedom Fighter, and I always found them quite sort of too obvious or something. I don't know. I didn't like that style, and I know it's often the publishers themselves that insist on particular titles in order to sell the book, but I wanted something a bit less obvious, and the humanity trigger. So what it is, it's a combination of the two different nicknames that were given to Richard Martin, who we talked about earlier in episode 1 of this, who was the guy that kickstarted everything off in a sense in 1822 with passing of the Cruelty to Cattle Act. So Richard Martin's two nicknames were Hair Trigger Martin, and he was called that because of his propensity for dueling, and apparently he had a short temper, and at the drop of a hat or a white glove, he'd challenged some opponent to a duel. Apparently, he had fought over 100 duels in his life, right? So, you know, he died an old man, so he must have been quite good at it. So there was Hair Trigger Martin, and then there was a name given to him by King George IV, who was a friend of his, personal friend of his, for his work for animals, and that was Humanity Dick. So I put together Humanity and Trigger and got the Humanity Trigger. It was either that or Dick Hair. So
yeah,
I think
I should have put that together actually. But to be honest, I was thinking it was something to do with animal rights violations being a trigger to you.
Yeah, it's a multi. I mean, it's vague enough or it's obscure enough to hang a few different meanings onto it. It's quite it's got the anarcho-punk sort of vibe to it as well. I think Humanity and Trigger, they're two opposing words in a sense, you know. Yeah, it was just like a more interesting title, I thought, than
yeah, academics in the future will be yeah, Deb said it's a good play on words, which
yeah, I thought it was a bit more eye-catching, I suppose, as well.
Yeah,
you
know, I guess so.
Yeah.
So we're on part 3. So I think this is about where we left off.
That's right.
Let me just get rid of that banner for a second. So we've so this is part 3, and you know, do you want to give a quick summary of what you've covered so far?
Yeah, so we're up now to about the sort of the 80s and 90s, and last episode we sort of covered the rise of the Animal Liberation Front and the hunt saboteurs, both in the UK initially, and then spreading over to Ireland and beyond, of course. And now we're moving into these two groups have found their feet. They've gathered a lot of numbers. I'm talking about the ALF and the hunt saboteurs, and during the 80s and 90s. There was a lot of significant events, both here in Ireland and in the UK. In terms of violence, it was always a lot more aggressive, I guess, over in the UK. So if we just go through a little bit of what was happening around then, on the top here we see 2 images of hired thugs that were paid to come in and beat up the saboteurs, essentially, especially down with the Surrey Union. Now, the Surrey Union were a notorious fox hunt based in Surrey, and they used to get sabbed by London groups and the Brighton saboteurs a lot, and more as well. But so they were getting sabotaged so effectively, so often that they couldn't just depend on the police or their own terrier men to do the dirty work for them. They hired in. On the left here, we see a squad of goons that were paid to come in from the East End of London, basically, to come in and beat up saboteurs. And on the right, we see a slightly more organised form of that. That's the Countryside Watch, I think they were called. And they were set up by a New Zealander, in fact, an ex-soldier who
Yeah, I think it's called Country Watch. I just want to
Country Watch.
also
Yeah.
issue a content warning, because in fact I need to apologize for last week, because we did have a bit of a gruesome picture of a fox who had been killed. We've had a quick skip through, and there's nothing really this week that's going to cause too much trouble. So it's kind of a content warning that you don't really don't need to worry
That's right.
that much.
That's right.
There's a bit of fisticuffs.
There's brawling, and there's what actually used to happen often was up and coming photojournalists fresh out of college would often ask to come out with their local saboteur group, because they knew that there was a good chance of them getting a very dramatic photo or two. And a few of them won prizes, I think Pulitzer prizes, for a guy called Andrew Testa, whose photographs some of these are from. So here's like another classic photograph of. So these guys are the Brixton mob. Okay, I need to explain a little bit about the Brixton mob, because they were very significant during the 80s and 90s in counteracting the extreme violence that the Hun sabotage movement was coming up against. So on the top here again, we see more hired goons. They're a so-called security firm, and these guys would arrive down and prevent the saboteurs from gaining access to public paths, which is completely against the law. They were basically taking the law into their own hands. The police were standing by and allowing them to do this. So the response from the Hun sabotage movement was equally dramatic, I would say. There was this group in Brixton called the Brixton Mob, who were basically anarchist squatters. There was hundreds of them all around Brixton, and at 2 or 3 in the morning on a Saturday morning, a couple of Land Rovers would do the rounds of the squats all around Brixton and pick up dozens of these guys, and they'd bring them all down often to the Surrey Union Hunt, and you could have upwards of 200 saboteurs taking on the might of the hired goons, basically, and the police and the hunters and their support.
Mark,
I mean, yeah.
Do us a favor. Go back one.
Yeah.
You see the baton that the copper's got there in his hand.
Yeah.
So it's that one where they swivel it around and they've got a big stick, and they swivel it around and they got a small one. It was a small one that I got hit with
in your eye
at Hillgrove.
Right.
And so that was a fractured jaw and everything. Yeah. So I just remember this thing coming out and hitting me about here.
It's extremely quick, right? It sort of comes from the side instead of straight on, and you don't see it coming. They sort of just swing them around, you know. So
they can kind of just twirl it in the hand.
That's right. Yeah. There's no effort. There's no sort of pre-warning or anything. So there was a continuing escalation of events, especially around the southeast of England. I must say there was a situation where if saboteurs were attacked by their local hunt on a given week, they'd invite a lot of extra sabs from around the area to come down for a regional hit, or if it was serious enough, for a national hit. If it was a national hit, you could have dozens of various sab groups arriving down on one hunt, and you could have 200, 300 saboteurs, all in black, all wearing balaclavas, piling out of all these black transit vans with the grills and the windscreens to prevent anyone from smashing the windscreens that the Brixton mob had. So it became a very heavy atmosphere at times, and Class War were probably the only political organization, if you could call them that were in any way genuinely interested in this. The left, particularly the far left, had no interest in animal rights at this time, I would say, pretty much at all. It was groups like Class War, was anarchist insurrectionist groups like Class War, who loved the idea of brawling with the rich and their supporters and the police, and saving a fox in the bargain, and getting a day out into the countryside as well. So it attracted, around this time, some saboteur groups attracted a lot of harder edge in response to the continuous violence that they were facing. I mean, around this time, around the early 90s, I'm talking about the UK again, there was 2 saboteurs killed, murdered essentially, in 2 separate incidents around Cheshire and Manchester, I think. It was Mike Hill and Tom Warby. And the 2 of them were young men. I think Tom Warby was 16, and it was his first time out sabbing.
Yeah, I think Mike went out with the Liverpool group, which I went out with.
Liverpool, yeah. And they were crushed to death by vehicles, you know. Police did nothing. So there had to be a response to this, and the response either was go home or escalate things up a notch and take these guys on. And it was the latter was the option chosen. So you had a lot of people who would come down, and there would be hundreds and hundreds of saboteurs, and violence at this point was almost inevitable. If you have enough people on both sides that are turning up, at some point there's going to be a punch up. So this led eventually to a group called the Hunt Retribution Squad, which was an informal, secretive offshoot of the Hunt Saboteurs, I suppose, or the Hunt Sabotage movement, who would deliberately attack hunters or their vehicles, and they were into using violence, whereas the Hunt Saboteurs Association do not use violence unless it's in self-defense. So here on the left, you see hundreds of saboteurs, or dozens, I think it was about 40 or 50 saboteurs, arriving down to the Hursley Hambledon hunt in Hampshire, who are a notoriously violent hunt. And the response that the saboteurs gave to their violence was to arrive down en masse and smash up all their vehicles and beat up anyone that got in their way, and then get out of the area. And a load were arrested, I think, afterwards, but all the charges were dropped, I think, in the end. So around this time, around the mid-90s, the late 80s into the 90s, into the late 90s, really, there was a lot of violence, including over in Ireland. I was the victim, along with comrades of mine, including Bernie, who were attacked by the Galway Blazers back in 1996. So at this time, there was a battle raging in the countryside, basically. And the police were quite content to either take the side of the hunt or to stand aside. Here we see on the left, we see the Galway Blazers being sabotaged back in 2019. So they're still being sabbed by a group there. And on the right, we see a saboteur pointing at that's a beagle pack. That's a foot pack hunting hares, I would imagine, and very easy to sabotage. And a lot of the recruits for these movements were coming from the anarcho-punk scene, which was a evolution and an offshoot of the original punk rock movement that took the idea of anarchy in the UK and anarchy everywhere else very seriously. And they were spearheaded by a group called Crass, who I think I mentioned earlier, who didn't actually mention animal rights much in their lyrics, but their whole tone was given towards that sort of idea. They're all vegetarian, and they did talk about it, but they didn't mention it the way, say, bands like Conflict did.
Well, this guy's got a Conflict T-shirt on, hasn't he? So
the picture of the cat and the restraining device.
Yeah, they had a song called "This Is the ALF," didn't they?
This is the ALF, yeah. So you had a band like Conflict. Then here's Crass, who were described as forever on the verge of exploding when they were playing live, which I thought was an excellent description of the fury of them. Up here, you have an album called "The Ungovernable Force" by Conflict, who there's a song called "This Is the ALF," which is so explicit and so direct that I guarantee them attention from Special Branch and from the Animal Rights National Index for years afterwards. They were dogged by police brutality and provocation, and they were spying on them and all the rest of it. So Conflict really pushed pro-ALF, pro-direct action message, and this resonated amongst their audience. And it's my contention that these guys provided a lot of what you might call the foot soldiers for these movements. During the 80s and 90s, there was an influx of younger, more radical actors in the animal rights scene, and they gravitated towards the direct action end of the spectrum, and really pushed the sort of a belligerent, I wouldn't say violent, but direct method of communication, and endorsing direct action and not pulling any punches, really, I suppose, if you like. And this was a step up from what had gone on previously, I think, in terms of the frequency of these direct actions.
Let me ask you a sociological question, Mark, because there's a lot of discussion nowadays in the modern movement about the kind of political leanings of the movement. And I've always said that back in the days that you're talking about, I mean, it was certainly left-leaning, if not pretty left, in my recollection. Does that chime with you, or...?
Yeah, what I would say is that the vast majority, if not probably more or less all, of the animal rights activists that I know or have ever come across are left, usually pretty far left, often anarchists, and there was a strain of green anarchist thinking in the sort of movement broadly overall, I would say, during the 80s and 90s. Having said that, a lot of people I know who identify with Marxism or as communists of the sort of the older tradition, of the more working class sort of tradition, have no time for animal rights, and the harder left they are, the more reactionary they tend to be.
Well, Marx had a terrible attitude towards other animals. I mean, he saw other animals as resources.
To be exploited. So which is very unfortunate, because the whole Marxist project, from what I can gather, and I'm not a Marxist and I haven't read much of his stuff, but I do know enough to know that the whole idea was to liberate and to be free from oppression, but he was only concerned about human oppression and human freedom. He talked of a concept, a driving force behind his politics was an idea called species being, and that's the idea that every species has certain needs and wants and desires that, if left unexpressed, cause misery and poverty and so on. And the idea of a communist society was to be free, to be unhindered, and to do what your species is made in nature to do.
There's a famous quote, isn't there, from Marx, where he says that in the after the revolution, as it were, then you would do what you want. You might be a critic in the morning, go fishing in the afternoon and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And then some people started to say, how come you Marxists don't see other animals as part of the proletariat? Mm-hmm. But they never really answered that, I don't think.
Yeah. I would say that farm animals are as much a part of the working class or working class themselves, right? And nature is the original superstructure. It's not industry, it's nature. So it's a pity that Marx didn't take a step or two back and see a bigger picture and apply his broader ideas and premises to nature and to non-human animals as well as human animals.
Yeah, some neo-Marxists did, people like involved in the Frankfurt School and stuff. They did, Herbert Marcuse in particular.
Yeah, it's a change a bit. So obviously there's Corey Lee Wren, who wrote the wonderful Animals in Ireland, I think, Animals in Irish Society.
Book,
And she's a Marxist, a feminist, a vegan. So there is a more modern and up-to-date version of Marxism that does include contemporary concerns about the environment and about animals specifically as well. So that is changing, but it took an awful long time, I must say. And I think the original Marxists back in the day sort of missed a thing there. They really sort of could have had it so much better, I think, if they had just included non-human animals as well. But there was a very little interest in that. I think generally they would have regarded that as a sellout and at best a distraction and at worst a sellout.
Yeah, but then they did the same with feminism. They thought that as well. So
yeah. So the class struggle is the be all and end all to some of these people, and that's a very reductive and limited way of looking at it.
Yeah, it is indeed.
So moving on, there's a few slides here. They're from my own personal collection. This is the group that I hooked up with when I moved to Hertfordshire, north of London in the United Kingdom. And the group there was the Chiltern Hunsabs. The Chiltern is a sort of an area of forest, sort of in Hertfordshire and Bedfordshire, north of London. So we used to sab around the North London area. And this is us on the last day of the season, which is sometime in March, and various hunts stop at various times throughout March. So the Vale of Aylesbury, who were the local hunt that we used to sab, used to usually be one of the last groups, the last hunts going in the season. So as a result, say by the last Saturday in March, these guys were one of the few hunts that were still going out. So they attracted saboteurs from all over the area who had no hunts of their own to sab for the day. So we'd all descend on that given day, the very last hunt of the season. It's quite a prestigious day for them. Here we are trying out a new tactic. Sitting in front of in the back of that white van there are all the hounds, and obviously they are vital to the hunt. So they're being brought from their kennels to where the hunt's going to meet up, and we're sitting in front of the van there, blocking the van, and we stayed there, I think, then for 3 or 4 hours until the local constabulary arrived and gathered enough numbers to then force us.
So what year is that? What year is that picture there?
This would have been like late 90s, 98, 99, I would imagine.
And are you still liaising with Ireland at the stage, or have you moved back?
No, I'd lost contact with the sabotage movement back there. I was sort of fully focused on what was going on in the UK, I suppose. I mean, I was still in touch with a few of the people there, but I knew that the West of Ireland Sabs had stopped because of the massive violence that was shown to us.
Here's a question you would like to take, I think, Mark. Deb says early orders only right now.
Okay, right. So here's the book. It arrived.
Hang on, I'll put you on big screen. There you go.
Okay. So the one of the early copies is a pilot copy of the book that arrived a few days ago. So it's available now for pre-order as hard copy and as an ebook from Earth Island Books.
I'm looking forward to getting a signed version of that, Mark.
Yeah, sure, yeah.
just to let you know.
yeah, and from December the 4th, it'll be available via Waterstones, Barnes and Noble, all good bookshops, Amazon, and direct from Earth Island as well. So hard copy, ebook, available from.
Any idea of the price, Mark? Yet?
It's £15. So about 13 New Zealand dollars. I think that's 20 euro or thereabouts, maybe a bit less. 17, 18 euro, I think.
I think that's pretty good in this day and age, I think.
Yeah, it is pretty good. Yeah. And they're Earth Island are a very small but very active sort of punk rock publishing house. They sort of specialize in that end of the spectrum, and they publish music. I
know that Ronnie, you mentioned Ronnie's book before, but he had terrible trouble getting the price down for his book. I mean, it's really, really expensive. So I think they had to buy it themselves in bulk. And then, yeah.
Oh, that sounds a bit awkward. Okay, yeah. I'm not too sure who published his book, but these guys that I'm dealing with are really good, and they're really upfront and fair and not greedy. So very happy to be working with them. So it'll be out soon, and all these photographs and more that you see in the slides are in the book. So here, it's me there with my little face mask and a black hoodie up, standing in front of the Hounds van. Again, we just sort of stalling them up and just using a different tactic. A note on police response to all this and contrasting it with the police response now that there's a ban in the UK. And Roger will confirm this, I'm sure. And it was the same in Ireland. They couldn't throw enough resources. The police couldn't throw enough resources into trying to control the hunt sabotage movement. They drafted in new laws. They broke those laws. They were happy to pay out millions in compensation. They would repeatedly break laws. They'd attack saboteurs, beat people up, false imprisonments, wrongful arrests. They'd have helicopters, riot vans. They'd be riding with the hounds. They could have dozens of guys out on foot. They could have the riot police. All of that against us. And even still, it didn't work. And the hunt still felt the need to bring in their own private security, like I was talking about earlier. And even then, it didn't work. So, despite all this, despite the police attention, the hunt sabotage movement continued to thrive and grow and be more and more effective, I think. And you contrast that with the police response to a ban in now. They're nowhere to be seen at a hunt. They have no interest in enforcing the new law.
Well, they said straight away that they just wasn't able to enforce it, didn't they?
They didn't have the resources, they said, but they had loads of resources. Up to the week of the ban, they had all the resources that they wanted to try and control us. And when the ban comes in, they have no resources to try and control the rich and doing what they're doing. So it's actually left now to the hunt sabotage movement to become hunt monitors and essentially try and enforce the law that the police should be doing themselves and doing the work for the police, essentially, and bringing prosecutions with the RSPCA and protect our wildlife and groups like that. So the hunt sabotage movement, in a sense, has morphed into, in the UK and so on, has morphed into a monitoring group as much as a sabotage movement. And when hunts go out pretending to drag hunt or whatever, as soon as they see sabs, often they go home because they know that their fun is spoiled. So things have changed over in the UK since the ban. I wouldn't say it's the end of hunting, but it's the beginning of the end of hunting, I would say.
Well,
This is
some
us
of them
again.
are pretty
This is back
blatant
in
about it,
98,
though, aren't they?
99 to emphasize drag hunting. Pardon?
So some of them are still pretty blatant about it. I was going to ask you actually, because Ronnie and I did a program about this recently, about the. It's just been announced that Scotland have banned hunting, which obviously they banned hunting at the same time as it's supposed to have been banned in the first place, and so it looks like they've brought in new laws now to kind of like fill the loopholes in the first legislation.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. The law states, the ban states that it's illegal to hunt quarry with dogs, but it doesn't mention any other animal. There was a hunt in the Midlands somewhere during 2010s, 2011s in Warwickshire maybe, that had a trained owl. They trained an owl to spot for foxes. So they had a local who would have an owl on a leash that was hovering above a guy who was leading the pack of riders, and the owl was looking out for foxes, and if the owl came across a fox, it would hoot, and then the fox would run, and then the chase was on. I don't know if you heard about this, and the local.
Well, I think that the use of birds of prey became quite common.
Yeah, but owls though.
Oh no, never heard that before. No.
Right, and the local SAB group had a guy who owned a gyrocopter. And they would go out in the gyrocopter and follow the hunt around and try and film any transgressions of the law, right? And the local hardmen in that hunt said that they were really annoyed at this guy that was coming out week after week and buzzing around them in his gyrocopter and filming their every move and all that. So they wanted to get at him. So one day, as the hunt were out and the gyrocopter was up and it was running low on fuel, and it needed to land at a nearby airfield to fuel up, and a van load of local thug heavies drove out to they saw the gyrocopter sort of landing in the distance, and they knew that it was going to land in Long Marsden sort of airfield, some sort of remote strip out in the Midlands somewhere. And the gyrocopter landed, and the van load of thugs sort of pulled up, and a guy hopped out called Trevor Morse, and he was a big, thick, pink sort of big, heavy sort of set man, and he stood in front of the gyrocopter, blocking its path as it tried to run along the runway to take off. And anytime that the guy in the gyrocopter tried to skirt past this guy, he'd stand in front of the gyrocopter again. And eventually, the back blade of the gyrocopter sliced this Trevor Morse guy's head right in two, dead instantly. It was all caught on video camera. Apparently, I haven't seen this, but apparently it was.
Yeah, I remember the court case, because I think because we used to call microlights. You're talking about, right?
No, it was a gyrocopter. It was like a tiny little helicopter, like a 2-person helicopter.
Oh, with the old twirly gig at the top.
Blades and sort of like a black back blade as well that went sort of the other way, Yeah. And it was the back blade.
Speaking of technology, Deb's asking, have the SABs used drones?
Well, drones are the big thing now. Yes, they are the big thing to monitor hunts. They are a cheap, effective way. I think basically they've superseded the use of things like a gyrocopter, which is a very expensive way of going about that. So drones are the way to do this now. And a lot of SAB groups are monitoring hunts with drones and using the drones to gather footage as evidence. So yes, it's the new bit of equipment. It's the modern form of the gizmo, I think,
Yeah, I used to drive my group absolutely bonkers. I used to say that we needed to get a microlight because in Essex, for example, there was 5 hunts, so you could kind of almost like SAB 5 at once.
Yeah.
But also, when I went back to Liverpool, that was where the Grand National was. It was also where the hare coursing was.
Oh yeah,
yeah. And so I was saying, if we have a gyrocopter or a microlight, that would be great. It would never happened, but it's
very expensive, I'm sure. Yeah,
I'm sure. Yeah,
it's beyond the budget of the average SAB group, I would imagine. Whereas like a drone, you can buy a drone, a really good one, for a couple of £100, I think.
Jennifer's asking. He got his head sliced into. Yeah, he was actually killed, wasn't he? So
he was killed straight away. He didn't even see it coming. The driver of the gyrocopter was initially charged with murder. That was dropped to manslaughter, and eventually he was found not guilty. and the guy that was killed, this Trevor Morse chap, was deemed to be responsible for his own death, essentially. But yeah, so around this time, so there was one hunter and two hunt saboteurs killed in the field, I suppose, like in the history of the hunt sabotage movement, as well as thousands being hospitalized and arrested and so on. Almost all on the hunt sabotage side. It's interesting when people talk about animal rights and violence. The connection between animal rights and violence is generally that if you're an animal rights activist, particularly a hunt saboteur, you're very likely to be a victim of violence, not an aggressor. So there's plenty of violence in the animal rights movement, but it comes from the opposition almost entirely, and the response from us is self-defense. It's very rare that hunt saboteurs or any other wing of the direct action movement or anywhere else in the animal rights movement is violent like that. It's usually a thing of self-defense. So here we have us. This is pre-ban. We're demonstrating in favor of drag hunting, which is when they drag a scent of a fox around a given area, and the hounds then try and follow and chase the scent. Rather than an animal. So this is us. We cross-dressed. We had banners saying "hunting makes us cross," and in brackets "dress," and time to turn to drag, ducky, and pantyhose, not tallyhose, and all that. And we marched into the field where the hunt were meeting. And
you wouldn't get away with that nowadays, I'm afraid, Mark.
Probably wouldn't. More innocent those days. And it made the ITN news, and we continued sabbing in our various outfits, wigs. This is Alan. He's a skinhead. Usually he's got a wig on. And yeah, it was a very funny sort of day. Again, it was the very last day of the season. It was the very last hunt of the season, so a bit sort of anything goes. Then where you try out new tactics and some of this. We were astounded by the level of state infiltration of the movement. This woman up top here, her spy name is Christine Green, and no one knows her real name. And she's the spy on us, the Chiltern Hunt Sabs, and I think the Reading Sabs and the West London group. This is actually her helping us sabotage a hunt. The guy here, just looking back at her, is a genuine Sab. He's a friend of mine called Rob. And yeah, so these spies were sent in, acting as let's go back to that again, acting as any other saboteur. They were obvious for their driving skills. They all had police special driving training, so they were really good at driving. A lot of them were quite aggressive and quite hostile against the hunt. And if it kicked off, some of them were straight in there, and they were punching and being punched the same as everyone else. So they got really stuck in. But they were for a group whose only aim really was to save foxes from being torn apart by dogs. The state seemed highly aroused by the activities of the hunt saboteur movement. Obviously, they were infiltrating the ALF as well, and that's a bit more understandable from the state's point of view. But they were really interested in controlling or trying to dissemble, I suppose, the hunt sabotage movement. I can only assume it's because the hunt are friends in high places, and they were putting pressure on the police, generally police forces around the area.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
On the saboteurs. So and this the police did. The infiltration though was bizarre. I mean, with this woman Christine Green, she infiltrated the West London Sabs for about 4 years. She was gone out with a well-known saboteur there at the time, and then she disappeared at the end of her deployment. The way they do, they leave a letter on the breakfast table of their lover or their friend's house, or whatever, saying I have to go to Australia, I'm burnt out, or something like this, and then they just disappear. But in her case, after she disappeared for a few months, she got back in touch with her boyfriend who was in the West London Sabs, and they reignited their relationship, and she returned to the UK. And the police went public on her, saying that she was a police spy. And then she wrote a public letter to the Guardian about how she had made these wonderful friends in the animal rights movement, and best friends she could ever have. And I think she had felt a bit betrayed by the police. But she had taken part in one of the biggest ALF raids in 1999, I think, when she took part in a raid on a fur farm somewhere, and 6,000 mink were freed. So these people were getting very, very involved in the actions of the groups that they were spying on. to the point where it was all very, very unethical and going into very grey areas. And I mean, we all know how that turned out. But apparently now, Christine Green, that isn't her real name, but her spy name, is still living up in Scotland somewhere with her ex-Hunt Saboteur boyfriend. And they're keeping a low profile. And I think a few people in the movements are aware of where they actually live. But otherwise, she went native essentially and dropped out.
Yeah, it's a tangled web, isn't it? Because I mean, there were some Sabs who went over to the Hunt and vice versa, wasn't there? So yeah,
there was a guy in the Chiltern Hunt Sabs, I forget his name, who I knew him from very early on, and he ended up with the Vale of Aylesbury Hunt. He ended up going out riding with them instead of slapping them. So there was weird, right? But I mean, I guess in anything like this, at the very extremities, there's going to be this sort of behavior.
Yeah, there was a guy in Liverpool, and I've never been able to work him out. He seemed to be some kind of double agent, and it was a little bit like you were saying about when they were kind of, as it were, on our side. They were quite violent towards the Hunt. Yeah, it was just the way that they were, kind of thing. Yeah, and I do remember one time this guy kind of saved me from a big crowd of hunters. He came charging into this field, with a big kind of branch or something, and cleared them all out of the way. And
right.
But then I think he was riding with them as well, and so it seemed to be we could never work him out.
I mean, so if they're in a situation where they really they're beyond the law, right? They know that if they get stuck in at a protest or a Hunt Sab and start throwing punches and all that, they aren't going to get into trouble for this. So even if they're arrested by local police who are unaware that they're spies, within 10 minutes there'll be a phone call made to their handler and they'll be out again. So they're acting with complete impunity. They're supermen. They can go in and they can do anything in the name of their job and get away with it. So for every other Hunt Saboteur who's a genuine saboteur, they're afraid of breaking the law. They might get caught. There's consequences. For them, there was no consequences to their actions. They were more likely to get promotion than a fine or imprisonment. So they had nothing to lose. So
there's a couple of comments to respond to. Ben saying that
shot down the drone.
Drones. One of the drones was shot down, and then Deb was saying the Sabs infiltrated the hunters. I don't know about that. You might do, Mark. I do know that some Sabs joined the Hunt as if they were supporters in order to get the meat card.
That's right. Well, there was a guy called Mike Huskisson as well, who was active, particularly in the 70s and 80s, who infiltrated the British Field Sports Society, as it was known then, and went out on hundreds of different mink, otter, fox hunts, all sorts, and had a camera, had a sort of hidden camera. And he's written 2 books. One's called Outfoxed, and the other book's called Outfoxed Again. And they detail his time as an undercover hunt supporter. Not an active hunter, but a hunt supporter. So he would follow the hunt around in his tweed, looking a bit like Jeremy Clarkson with his flat cap on and his little BFSS pin badges and looking the part. And he was doing this for years. And he was using a sort of a hidden camera and capturing all this footage that sort of
and that wasn't easy in those days because cameras were like big boxes.
I know, yeah. So it must have been very dangerous work. It's not like these days we can get pinhole cameras in a shop on the high street. It would have been much less subtle than that. So I mean, if he was caught doing that by the support in the field at the time, they would have kicked him to death. So very brave man. So I'm not sure if it happened that often, but Mike Huskinson was deep undercover for years and produced these 2 books and loads of reports. And I think he used to work in tandem with the League Against Cruel Sports and pass on the information to them to use in prosecutions and public information and all this sort of stuff. So it didn't happen nearly as much as the police infiltrating the saboteurs, I'll tell you that. But it did happen a little bit. This is our group enjoying a beer in the pub after a hard day sabbing. And that's the end of the slides. Cheers and get off my fucking land. And we could take some questions and answers. We could do a questions and answers thing now or something like that. But that's the end of my pictures. And as I say, all this story and all these images are in the book, which will be out in a few weeks' time.
Wow. So it's been quite a story, really. It goes all the way
Yeah.
back to kind of like animal welfare through to the big focus on Ireland was last week, I suppose. And then you've still got a few connections this time.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Why did you call the title "The History in Ireland"? Because you kind of it's wider than that, really, isn't it?
Yeah, it sort of meanders. I suppose the book's in two halves really. There's one half is a more academic look at all the publicly available information about the Irish scene, and then and then the other half really is an autobiographical account of my story in Ireland and in the 16 years I spent in the UK. I think I included it because it's part of the Irish story. The evolution of the movement in Ireland wouldn't have happened if it hadn't been for the movement in England, really. And I think it sort of added sort of context. Yeah, it does meander a little bit. So the title is slightly misleading. It isn't just about the Irish history. It does include the my part of my involvement in the UK scene as well, and a bit of the broader history there to give context. But I guess it's just part of a wonderful story, really. So I didn't want to leave it out.
No, indeed. I mean, I'm not complaining. I'm just asking. Was the main thing about it. Right, we've got no new comments coming in.
Okay.
So it's been quite a blast. Now, as I said before we came on, I do these kind of archive things now. So I'll probably put the three together, so people can watch it all the way through. There we've got one from Joanne. What is your handle on the socials and which platforms are you on?
Okay, so I've got a website called thehumanitytrigger.com, which is a poorer written version of the book, basically, but it contains some more photographs that I couldn't include in the book because of copyright reasons. So it's where the book came out of, and that's thehumanitytrigger.com. I run a Facebook page in Oakland as well called Vegan Living Oakland, which is the vegan outreach stuff that I do in Oakland, sort of thing. But it's less, it's more of a local thing but yeah, those two places.
Yeah, humanitytrigger.com.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think you might have sent me that link.
Yeah, I've got it here. Show. There we go.
Yeah. And also, Deb is saying, I think you've kind of really touched on this already in a sense. Do you think any of the police infiltrators were also provocateurs?
Undoubtedly. I mean, you look at Mark Stone alone. Absolutely. And they always have been, and it's part of their job, even if they don't admit it. Their public face is that they don't have sex with activists, and they don't break the law, and they don't provoke. They do all these things by the bucketful. But officially, they're just there to sort of stand in the background and gather information. But no, they fully embed, and the only way that they can embed convincingly is by getting stuck in. And Mark Stone,
they take that a bit seriously, don't they? Embed a bit.
Yeah, absolutely. Embed at the enemy. I mean, my God, the stuff that they were doing, really,
Yeah, I mean, we joke about it, but we shouldn't really. But if people want to really check up on that, we mentioned this before. You can go to Spy Cops online, and that's got a kind of history of all the different groups, London Greenpeace, etc., and everything. In terms of provocateurs, I was once told by somebody who reckoned they were in the know that if the state, as it were, can't hold a movement back, they'll often push it forward.
Yeah. Okay.
And that's got two kind of ramifications. It kind of pushes the radicals away from the mainstream of the movement to create a division there, but also it pushes them into actions which the police then have got the powers to really do something about.
Yeah.
So right. that kind of makes sense, doesn't it? Really.
That's right. Over in the United States, it's been a big problem there. That very thing with infiltration, but it was here as well. And Mark Stone was active over in Ireland too. His ex-wife is Irish, from Cork actually, so he used to spend a lot of time in Cork, spying in various groups and visiting his wife and family there.
Yeah, I know you mentioned the Galway Blazers a couple of times, but they had, you were saying that some of the English hunts had a more violent reputation. I think from us over there, the Irish hunts seem to have a really bad reputation too.
Yeah, I mean the most violence I've seen has probably been it's a toss up really between the southeast of England and the west of Ireland, really, in terms of the violence. There was a lot of violence in, as I was mentioning earlier, with the Brixton mob and the sort of black bloc tactics and all that. The impression that the British activists had was Ireland was the real hard edge, and the movement was so small and new there, and the establishment were really keen to squash it before it grew. And the violence was, I think it was probably worse over in Ireland in terms of us being the victims, and over in the UK it was more even-sided, actually. I think.
Well, I'll tell you my own perspective on it was the fact that I used to do the press for the HSA when we did the Waterloo Cup. The Waterloo Cup was the biggest hair crossing event in the world at the time, and we used to have this little cottage in a place called Dungeon Lane, and we used to get calls from all over the world and everything. And but you know, we did that, and a lot of the coursers were Irish who'd come over for the day. They get kind of pissed and, you know, smash up the local pubs and everything. And as you said last week, I think, Mark, of all the hunters, the coursers were really, really violent, weren't they?
Coursers have the worst reputation. Coursers and terrier men at foxhounds were the two most violent demographics of people I think I've ever come across. So yeah, I'm not sure what it is. I think even coursers amongst the hunting world are sort of frowned upon, even. You know,
I think so. I think
there is a hierarchy.
The riffraff, aren't they?
The real scum of the earth are the sort of coursers. But if you're really posh and of money, then you're a fox hunter, and that's the sort of acceptable face of it. You know.
You know, I'll tell you how things changed really with the press, for example. When I used to do the Waterloo Cup, there was a lot of interest from all over the world. As I said, the phone was going all day and everything. And like 3 years later, nothing. You know, and you'd be having to ring them, and you know, you'd ring up the Liverpool Echo or something and go, you know, we're doing the hunt, we're doing the Waterloo Cup and everything, and they'd go, has anybody been arrested? And you'd say no, and you'd say, has anybody been injured? And you'd say no. And they well give us a ring when they have.
When that happens, yeah,
that's how it changed. Yeah,
that's right. Yeah. If it bleeds, it leads. That's the media. Yeah,
that's it. Yeah, if it bleeds, it leads. Yeah, that's the tagline. All right. Right. Okay. So I think we can possibly end our epic time together, Mark. It's been a real pleasure. It's been absolutely great.
Thank you very much for having me on. It's been great fun talking about this.
Yeah. Well, obviously, it's brought back quite a few memories
sure.
for me, of course. And so it's been quite a gas, really. So thanks for writing your book. And thanks for putting together your prize, your thing. So we'll see you when you got your second book out, shall we?
Okay, yeah. Part 4. Yeah, excellent. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, everyone, and we'll see you again.